Gary Bates is the head of ministry for Creation Ministries International in Australia, and he's also the CEO of CMI-Worldwide. CMI now has 7 offices around the world. He's a regular contributor to the world-renowned Creation magazine, which now has subscribers in over 170 countries. But Gary is best known as the author of Alien Intrusion, UFOs, and the Evolution Connection, which is the only creation book on Amazon.com top 50 bestseller list. The book deals with the highly controversial UFO phenomena from a biblical perspective. Please welcome up Gary Bates from Australia.
Thank you. Well, good day. Okay, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. So the reality is, I read somewhere that, when pastors spend weeks preparing sermons, that the audience retention rate is about 10%. So I've got quite a long session here, and that doesn't encourage me very much that you're going to remember a lot, but I'll show you how you can remember most of it by telling you some of the resources, etc., that we have at the end. First part of my talk, I'm going to lay a framework because, a lot of people in the church today, they say, well, creation, evolution, it's just one of those side issues that the church is dealing with. We can deal with issues like stem cells and therapeutic cloning and abortion and homosexuality and all of these issues. But actually, I believe that this is the issue of all issues for the church today because it's a foundational issue. And you'll see that this UFO phenomenon, if you like, is also a subset of this issue that we have to deal with. But unless the church, if you like, reclaims its origins, we're really not going to understand how people think. We're not going to continue to be relevant to the culture out there with the questions that they have. Now, I should imagine for the Christians here today, if you've been out sharing your faith with people, have you had questions like, well, if the Bible's true, tell me how you fit dinosaurs in there. If the Bible's true, tell me where the races came from. What about distant starlight, billions of light years away? How do you fit that into a normal plain reading of Genesis that, and if we looked at the chronologies in the Bible, really only gives us a date in the thousands of years if we take it at face value? Or what about this question, probably the number one question I believe that we would get as Christians today. If there's a God of love, why does he allow all the death and suffering in the world? Would that be probably the number one question you receive today? Well, see, my experience is most Christians sort of say, well, don't worry about that. One day when we'll get to heaven, we'll find out all the answers. But in fact, there are actually very simple, straightforward answers to those questions. And what people are doing when they ask you those questions, they're actually saying to you, tell me why I should believe what you believe. They are stumbling blocks to their faith. And the reason is because our culture has changed in the last 30 to 40 years or so. And I believe it's linked to this teaching of evolution in school as fact. Now, I just want to do a couple of things at the moment. As I said, we're going to be pushed for time. I'm going to race through this. But we have a website called creation.com where you can get most of the answers to the most asked questions in over 32 years that our ministry has been around. There's nearly 7,000 fully searchable articles on that website. So questions on creation, evolution, you'll find most of them there. We have a free email news called InfoBytes. And we send it out to supporters when there's some claims in the news or something like that we think that people should know about. There was one that Jesus really didn't walk on water, he just walked on ice. So there's a naturalistic explanation. This one here, you remember Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter? He's actually more famous in this country than my own, funny enough. But, his zoo is just a couple of hours north of where I live in Brisbane. And when he died, lots of people, Christians and non-believers, actually contacted us and saying, well, if God's a God of love, and he's the creator, did he design stingrays to kill people? How would you answer that question? It's a valid question, by the way. Well, Dr. David Catchpole, one of our research scientists, he wrote an article called The Stingray of Death on our website. We put it into our free email news, send it out to our supporters, just a paragraph with a link to the article. Do you know that within 10 days that became the most visited article ever on our website? And that told me that in this electronic age, people were just clicking forward to their friends and their family, and people were getting good biblical answers as to why there is death and suffering, why we see it, apparent design in creatures to see death and suffering. One of the reasons I got involved in this is actually I saw the link in sci-fi and extraterrestrial beliefs linked to what is the core focus of our ministry, which is the creation-evolution debate. But I was really confronted when I started to research this subject. I'll be quite frank with you, I thought that maybe people who had abduction experiences, well, they were just UFO wannabes and it was in the realm of psychological delusions. But after meeting dozens and dozens of people who've had experiences, I came to realise that they can't all be watching the same science fiction movies. But, you know, I wrote this book really as a layperson's book. It's a creation book, but it's in disguise. You won't see Jesus, God, or the Bible mentioned on the cover anywhere. And as Guy mentioned, it's been an Amazon top 50 bestseller. And we mentioned that, but it's not to boast, because in fact more non-Christians have read this book than Christians. Because presumably that's the majority of people who buy the book on Amazon, right? And, you know, we've seen conversion testimonies come through it, and it's a great conversation starter. Now, Joe mentioned these guys this morning, Spread the Word Ministry. They wrote to me when my book was published. I'm sitting there in Australia, and I find out a major Christian ministry in the United States took an advertisement in World Magazine, and they listed it as one of the top 10 books every Christian should read. And I thought, wow, I'm glad. Some people in the church are starting to see this as an issue that needs to be addressed, right? So anyway, I wrote to these guys and I said, hey, could you let me use that sticker for my own website? You can see it on the back of my laptop there, how I've incorporated it. And they were generous enough to allow me to do that. And I was at my local shopping mall, you know, and I was in the shopping centre, and it was one of these undercover car parks. And I parked the car and I walked to the entrance, and this man was shouting as I got to the entrance, "Oi, mate, you!" And I looked around with about a dozen other startled people, and he's pointing his finger at me, and he said, "Oi, you, stop, you, there!" And he started running at me. And I thought, hello, it's going to be on, you know. What did I do? And he runs up to me breathlessly and he said, "Mate, I saw that sticker on your car. Where do you think aliens come from?" In the middle of a shopping centre. Now, that's happened numerous times since. But I hit him with 5 fast facts, and that's all you need to know. And I said, well, do you know what? I said, no 2 UFO sightings have ever appeared alike, exactly alike. We never see them enter our atmosphere from outside. When they appear, they're already here. You know, what happens is we see silvery, shiny objects, metallic-looking craft fly into one another at incredible speeds, become one object, fly off in different directions, and they defy the very laws of physics. People that claim abductions, they say the aliens pass through the walls or the roof, and then when they get abducted, they claim they go through the walls or the roof. I said, what can be happening? Can that really be happening to real physical beings, real physical craft? And he said, man, I've never heard any of that stuff before. He said, how come you know so much? And I said, well, I just happen to have written a book on the subject. And then I sold him a copy. But the point is, there I am in the middle of a shopping centre having an opportunity to use this information to engage people about it, you see. See, what happens is, regardless of what the facts are, and I'll talk about what are facts, what is evidence, we all have a worldview, everybody. Once you reach an age of understanding, you develop a worldview. You're probably thinking, do I have a worldview? And no, I don't, but actually you do. Everybody, once you reach that age of understanding, you develop a worldview. And a worldview is like a set of glasses for which you view all of reality around you. That's how you interpret your world. It's like a set of glasses, a filter, a framework. And think about this, I believe that people's worldviews primarily are made up by where you think you came from. Think about that. If you think that you are just, you know, the byproduct of chance random processes over millions of years, evolution, then you know what? There's ultimately no meaning and purpose to your life. What you believe about where you came from also affects your belief about what you think happens to you when you die. If you've come from nothing, guess what? You're going to nothing. But hey, if there's a creator, and if God's revealed himself to us, as the Bible says, that's how we can find out about him, well, he says there is meaning and purpose to your life. You're created with a purpose, and there's life after this one. So the decisions you make in this life are pretty important. Your worldview interprets how you behave. I'm a former evolutionist here today. He used to go around ridiculing Christians, so I've had a real conversion experience. Let me give you an example of that behaviour that you might play out according to your worldview. I remember watching those Ethiopian famines in Africa many years ago. Remember those? Seeing starving women and kids. Terrible situation. But consistent with my evolutionary worldview, I said, well, you know what? They're obviously just overpopulating, so what we need to do is allow them to die out, stop wasting money. It's just going to happen again next year, and allow nature to restore the balance. Now, I'm horrified that I used to think like that, but it was consistent with my evolutionary worldview. Now, as a Christian, what would be my motivation for going helping those people? Well, if the Bible's history is true, if we take it at face value, They are related to Adam and Eve. They are human beings. They're made in the image of God. And when Jesus walked this earth and he healed the sick and he fed the hungry and clothed the poor, he was reversing, if you like, the effects of the curse, wasn't he? That would be my motivation, following his example. See, folks, I'm a realist. Evolution is the most popular view, the most ruling paradigm of today, but does it mean that it's the truth? See, most people believe in evolution. You know why? Because that's all they've been taught. Anybody here heard information for creation in the classroom or on the media? Of course not. Like me, I was only ever exposed to one point of view, but I believe the evidence for creation and a young earth is not only scientifically defensible, but also logically and theologically defensible. See, there are consequences with our ideas. Have you heard this idea, that ideas have consequences? See, remember I said worldview? Our worldview is made up by where we think we came from. See, if you like, a non-Christian worldview says the earth's been here 4.5 billion years, death, suffering, bloodshed, disease over millions of years, that's led to man's existence. You and I are the pinnacle of evolution, but we all just came from pond scum. Makes you feel kind of special, doesn't it? See, what are the implications? Well, if evolution is true, the materialistic worldview, because that's what it is, it's the driving mechanisms, the engine room behind humanism. Everything made itself. No creator, nobody owns me, therefore you can do what you want with your life. I want to sleep with another guy, who's to say that's wrong? It's my body after all. The Bible's morality gets rejected. Why? Because its foundational book gets rejected. If the first book's not right, where does the truth begin? Which bits are you going to pick out to suit yourself? You've got to take it all, I believe, or none. Okay, so you can make up your own rules about life if you're just an evolved ape, but you know what? If the Bible's history is true, we're all descended from Adam, God sets the rules. Sorry about that. It's his creation, his universe. But what do I mean when the Bible's history is true? Well, read it yourself. Go to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and you can actually trace Jesus' ancestry. One line through Mary, one line through Joseph. You'll go back to, who's there? Solomon, David, Abraham, all the way back to who? Adam. Real people in real time and space to show that the Bible is real history. And you know what? You can actually map out those chronologies. Remember, Usher dated the world around about 4004 BC. I actually think that's pretty old, believe it or not. The only reason we don't think it's old is because we're all indoctrinated in the idea of millions and billions of years. But, you know, it's interesting that if you looked at those chronologies, you can't get millions of years in there. Isn't that interesting? Even if there were gaps, which I don't think there are, you're not going to get millions of years in there. Have a look at this. Jeffrey Dahmer, sadly one of America's worst serial killers, when he was in prison on NBC, he said, if a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, he said, what's the point of trying to modify your behaviour to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believe the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. You know, when we died, that's it. There's nothing. Well, it's a pretty sad story, isn't it? Now, you might think that's an extreme example, but, you know, I've had conversations with dozens and dozens of teenagers who say, hey, you know what? There's no life after death. You just live, you die, they burn you up, they put you in the ground. Now, you know, have you ever been to Australia? Anybody here been to Australia? Land down under? Yeah. What do you think of it? Pretty nice? Yeah? You know why Australia's so nice? I often tell people it's full of Australians. That's why. But anyway, the reason I ask that is, do you know that we actually have the second highest youth suicide rate in the developed world in Australia? And yet most of us all live near the coast. We've got everything we want. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But the more you teach people they've come from nothing and they're going to nothing, teenagers actually have it hard these days. There's a lot of pressures. Hormones, relationships on top of studies, etc. So have a look at what our leading teachers and philosophers are telling us today. Bertrand Russell, he says, well, we're just a curious accident in a backwater. Peter Atkins from Oxford, he says, we're just a bit of slime on the planet. Here we have Stephen Jay Gould, remember him? Former professor of paleontology at Harvard. He's now dead, so I believe he's become a creationist. He says, we're a fortuitous cosmic afterthought, a tiny little twig on the enormously arborescent bush of life. That's pretty language, isn't it? And Richard Dawkins, you know this man? The world's most rabid anti-Christian today. His book, The God Delusion, an Amazon #1 bestseller. And lots of people like his stuff. He says we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, but nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And you wonder why young people are committing suicide. See, folks, when we talk about the past, evolution or creation, and you hear evolution is science, well, you need to understand it's a different type of science. And I've broken it down like this. You see, the type of science, when we hear that word, that we understand when we hear that word, is what we call operational or experimental science. Now, that deals with experiments that you can do in the present, you can repeat those experiments, and you can observe the results. So if I wanted to, test this theory of gravity, I could probably jump on the hotel roof and take a nice swan dive. I'd do it in the present. I couldn't repeat it, but you folks could observe the results. Oh, gravity really works. But what about evolution? Or what's known here as historical or forensic science? See, it deals with events that happened in the past. Those events supposedly happen only once only, or one-off. Do we see evolution happening today? Now, some of you might be thinking of natural selection. I'm going to talk about that. Do you know, I was in South Africa a few years ago, and this guy came up to challenge me, and he said, "You creationists, you bang on about operational science and then you actually ignore it." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, fossils." He said, "Everybody knows that fossils take millions of years to form." He said, "Therefore, your idea of a young earth, young creation is just blown right out of the water." How would you answer that? See, questions are actually an opportunity. Because I was actually able to show this guy he was basing his whole eternal destiny on something he knew very little about. And that's what people understand about evolution. Most people believe it to be true. You actually ask them what they know about it. Very little. So I actually showed him a picture like this one. And I said, "Well, are you interested in fossils?" "I'm interested in fossils." I said, "Is there a particular fossil you've got a problem with?" Most people don't know the names of any fossils. And see what's special about this one? We believe it's extinct. It's a marine reptile called an ichthyosaur. 2 metres is just over 6 feet. But notice what's really neat about it? There's the baby coming out of the birth canal. Now, some of you mothers here may have had very difficult labours, right? But can you imagine giving birth slowly over millions of years while you're slowly being fossilised? Of course, doesn't make sense. So what had to happen to this great creature in the process of giving birth? Well, I'll show you from the books that I was taught at high school in Australia. And I know you have the same books here. I've seen them in England. And they're actually being taught at elementary level now. And this is how they explain how fossils are formed. Here's old Freddy Fish swimming along, and he dies and he sinks to the ocean floor. Now, while he's lying on the ocean floor, look at these high mountains. A little bit of mud and sediment over a long period of time gradually washes out, buries the fish, and then the process starts again, and we get something like the geologic column from that. Well, let's have a think about this, because that's what I was taught to think, and much better you teach people how to think. Actually, what happens to fish when they die? Do they sink or do they float? You would think in the wild they float. Other fish come in, chew some lumps off. Maybe the carcass sinks to the bottom, and crabs, crustacean, bacteria. You're lucky if you've got a piece of backbone left after the couple of days, right? So how do you get a fossil, like this one, using that process? See, what you actually need, here's old Freddy Fish swimming along, you need a lot of mud and a lot of water in a little bit of time. You can bury the fish quickly in those layers, and before long you can get yourself a rapid fossil. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, "Wow, yeah, that's a bit simplistic," because it's actually the process of permineralization. That's where the organic material is slowly replaced and turned to stone. Isn't that the process that takes millions of years? Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't. Here's a fossil hat. It was a soft felt miner's hat buried in a volcanic explosion in New Zealand, and 20 years later they dug it out of the cabin, and it had turned to stone, solid stone, in less than 20 years. I suppose you could say it evolved into a hard hat, right? But what about this one from my home state of Western Australia? A solid rock ring exposed at low tide up in the far northwest, very, very remote outback regions. And we shipped it down to where I was living in Perth, and we broke it open. Any guesses? Tyre. Yeah, lots of people say a tyre, but have a look. A roll of fossilised fencing wire. And you can even see the individual strands of wire there. See those? Less than 50 years. Here, remember when the station workers were coming through, throwing the old rolls into the ocean thinking they'd decay? What about this one? It's great when you teach people how to think. Some readers of Creation magazine were walking along a beach in Brisbane, and a young boy said, "Hey, this stone looks a bit different to all the others on the seashore," and he turned it over, and inside was a car. See that? So rocks can even form quickly under the right conditions. See, let's have a bit of fun here today. If I was to go home today and start digging in my back garden, and I was fortunate enough to dig up a Tyrannosaurus rex leg bone, okay? Well, am I digging up the past or the present? Give you a moment to think about it. Now, put your hand up if you think you're digging up the past. Come on, be brave, anybody? Digging up the past, okay. Anybody digging up the present? That means most of you are too chicken to say. Actually, I gave you a clue because I said if I dig up that fossil today, I exist in the present. So does the fossil exist in the present? It had a past, but it doesn't come with a label on it telling you how old it is, does it? No. See, creationists, evolutionists, folks, we all have the same facts, the same evidence, the same DNA, the same rock layers, the same fossils, the same distant starlight. We come to vastly differing conclusions because we already have a belief system about the past. That's our worldview. See? Now, the idea, by the way, of millions of years, you're probably thinking, well, Gary, don't they do radiometric testing to determine the age of something? Well, listen to this carefully, folks. There is no radiometric dating method you can use to prove the age of anything. It doesn't work like that. All you were doing is measuring radioisotopes in your sample. But how do you know how much was in it when it died? Has any been added? Have the decay rates been constant? Any been taken away? What were the atmospheric conditions like? What were the burial conditions like? You've got to make a whole range of assumptions about the past. Let me give you an example. You know, if I walked into a bathroom and I saw a bathtub with 20 gallons of water in it, and there's a tap running, and I measure the flow rate of the tap, and I find out that the tap is running or filling the bathtub at 1 gallon per minute. So how long did it take to fill the bathtub? 20 minutes? How do you know that? Were you there? Was some water in the bathtub to start with? Did somebody take some out during the time? Did somebody turn the tap off? And so on and so forth. See what I mean? That's just a simplest. It's exactly the same with radiometric dating. And if you don't believe me, here's a quote. I've saved the scientist's name, but he wrote to our geologist, Taz Walker, who's written a lot about radiometric dating. And he objected to the idea that we say scientists interpret the results according to their own belief system. And he said, it's not true that scientists need to assume, I've underlined the key words, what they are trying to prove before arriving at an answer. Scientists measure the decay rate of radioactive nuclides today and assume that it was always the case in the past. See the problem? Made an assumption, didn't he? And the problem is, and I'm not here to ridicule evolutionists, as I say, I used to be one, that because we're only taught one way to interpret the information, we can only think one way. Whereas if we stepped outside the squares, we'd think differently. You know what? And this is a key point, ladies and gentlemen. The idea of millions of years didn't come from distant starlight. You know, Charles Darwin, when he went on his famous voyage, under his arm he had a copy of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. And this book, well, Lyell's aim, he said, was to free science from Moses. And what he said was, the present is the key to the past. Uniformitarianism, it's called. And a great example of that is the Grand Canyon, how it's interpreted. You see, I was told at school that the Grand Canyon was 2 billion years old, and the Colorado River had cut the canyon over a process of about 500 million years, 500,000 years. Now, the reason they think it's billions of years old, if you see these coloured bands in the rock, they're called strata. And in between the strata are very fine layers called sedimentary layers, and it's generally believed that each one is laid down 1 per year by the moving effects of water or some other process. So when you see 2 billion layers, you presume you're looking at 2 billion years of Earth's history. Ask the question, did they see the layers laid down? It's an assumption about the past. Well, and again, the canyon cutting it over 500 million years. But if you've ever been around creation material very much, in fact, one of the first creation lectures I ever went to was this one about Mount St. Helens in Washington State. Now, the reason we use this, because it's the most well-documented videotaped event in our modern, geologic event in our modern history. Scientists were crawling all over the place. We knew it was about to explode. And when it did, in 1980, in fact, 1/3 of the volcano exploded. It didn't blow its top, it blew its side. And it blew lumps of rock over 6 miles from the blast site. But this guy's just a baby compared to the geologic events we see in the geologic record of the past. But you know what's interesting? Subsequent afterflows of Mount St. Helens laid down strata. Remember those wide bands I mentioned? And in between, here's this middle section here, 7 metres, that's I think about 23 feet of sediment. When you have a close look, very fine laminations, thousands of them. That what I was taught at school how to interpret those conventionally is that each layer takes a year, so that must be thousands of years of history. But in fact, that 23 feet of sediment was laid down precisely on June 12, 1980 in just 3 hours. as a result of the catastrophic events of Mount St. Helens. You go back to Mount St. Helens today, there's canyons all over the place. And this one here is called Engineers Canyon. And you're looking at the North Fork of the Toutle River. And again, because of the way we've all been evolutionised to think about the data, you'd think that that river must have ebbed and flowed at different times of seasons and floods in the past and eroded the canyon over a long period of time. But the reason it's called Engineers Canyon is because nearby Spirit Lake had overfilled with water from the volcanic explosion, and engineers diverted the water into what was this little gully and eroded it in a matter of 8 months. And don't think all the material was soft. The floor of the canyon is solid basalt, some of the hardest igneous or volcanic rock you can get. By the way, see my pointer in the corner there? That guy there, he's called Little Grand Canyon because he's a 1/40th scale of the Grand Canyon. And that one actually took 1 day to form, a whole day. So remember I said we have worldview glasses? So can you think of an event, if I took the Bible at face value and used that as my worldview filter for understanding my word, can you think of an event that the Bible describes that could account for the thousands and thousands of feet of sediment that we see all over the world, and those layers that's laid down actually have fossils in them, things that have been buried very, very quickly? Could you think of an event that the Bible describes? What am I talking about? The flood. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, the millions of years came from the rock layers. That's a key point. What about human evolution? I'm just flying through, and this is just a foundation. I'll get to the UFO stuff in a moment. What about human evolution? Well, you're looking at a picture of Boxgrove Man. This guy is Europe's most exciting human fossil find. And the newspaper clipping there says Europe's oldest known man lived 500,000 years ago, ate elephant, was tall and robust. So you can see he's depicted as the classic missing link. Deep set eyes, lots of facial hair, that typical ape man-looking creature. So what did they find to represent him like that? A whole skeleton you would find, but guess what? It's that little piece of shin bone there. That's all they found. Was interpreted to that. So when you hear these claims, it's wise to say, what is the evidence? How did they derive that view? See, they already believed there was a view of human evolution because that's probably what they were taught at school and college, you see. So they interpreted according to that worldview. You know, one of the world's famous paleontologists, that's people who dig up bones for a living, was a guy who used to work at the British Museum of Natural History, arguably the world's most fine collection of fossils, Dr. Colin Patterson. He wrote a book on fossils. And a man named Luther Sunderland wrote to him and said, Dr. Patterson, in your book, he said, you didn't mention any of those in-between kinds, you know, the intermediates, the missing links, if you like. You know what Dr. Patterson wrote back? He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. He goes on and says, yet Gould and the American Museum people, Stephen Jay Gould, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one can make a watertight argument. Now, they should be hostile witnesses to my belief system because they're evolutionists. But at least there they were being candid about it. What about dinosaurs? Probably the most commonly thing used to this idea of millions of years. Well, you're looking here at a picture of a Tyrannosaurus rex blood vessel, and those red blobs are actually unfossilized blood cells. So what I mean is the material is still in its organic state. And that's pretty significant, folks, because the last dinosaur supposedly walked the earth 65 million years ago. So how could organic material remain for millions of years? See, we just hear the expression millions of years, we just don't think about how long that is. Think about how long 1,000 years is. I mean, I can't even imagine that long. And we sort of talk about millions as if it's nothing. The lady discovered this, evolutionist, Dr. Mary Schweitzer from Montana State University. She said, it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? So here's the question. Actually, how does she know they're 65 million years old? Can she know they're 65 million years old? No, she can't. She can't do a test on it. In fact, her belief in evolution there is an inhibitor to good science because the most obvious conclusion you read is that the bones could only be, maybe hundreds of years old at the most. By the way, the same scientist, and this was reported in Science magazine, one of the world's most prestigious science journals, They went on an expedition to Alaska and they had this giant T-Rex leg bone and they couldn't get it in the helicopter, so they broke it open, and they got a surprise because they found ligament, sinew, flesh, blood vessels, more red blood cells, and she said they were flexible and resilient when stretched, returned to its original shape. Doesn't sound like 65 million year old material, does it? See, folks, are there many ways to interpret Genesis? Can all views be correct? Just logically think about it. How can there be many ways to determine the truth or interpret the truth? You know, there's a local flood theory. I toyed with that one. Couldn't have been a worldwide flood because we don't see global floods today. But if you read the scriptures, it gives you an indication Noah probably took 100 years to build a giant ship. The dimensions are given in the Bible to escape a local flood. I mean, he could have packed a suitcase and walked off to another country in that time, couldn't he? Why were birds on the ark? To escape a local flood. Theistic evolution, the idea that God used evolution. You know, he lit the fuse of the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, allowed it to take over. That's what I used to believe. By the way, I just want to mention here to give you a heads up, you need to be conscious and careful when people call themselves creationists today. What sort of creationists are they? Dr. Hugh Ross from the Reasons to Believe ministry, he believes in a Big Bang 14 billion years ago and soulless ape men before Adam. You know what? My friend Dr. John Hartnett, professor at the University of Western Australia, one of the world's leading physicists, cosmologists today, he's got some books out there. He says, you know what? There's a dozen different versions of the Big Bang going around today. So which one are you going to hang your scripture on? And when the science changes, you're going to have to revise your theology once again. Framework hypothesis, you know, the Bible's not real history. It's just, if you like, a literary framework, a poetic framework to help us understand the nature of God. Sadly, the most popular view in a lot of Bible colleges. The gap theory. Well, there might be gaps in Genesis 1:1. You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and in that gap, we can stick all those radiometric dates and the geologic layers. And then verse 2, we can talk about the infilling of God's creation in 6 days. I don't have time to talk about these ideas in depth, but just go to Exodus 20:11, and it says, "For in 6 days," and there's no period, no gap, "for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, everything in 6 days rested for one." There's no gap. By the way, that Exodus 20:11 is a very important passage of Scripture because it's actually one of the 10 Commandments, inscribed by the finger of God in tablets of stone, it says. What are some of those other commandments? Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. I don't suppose most of us have too many issues with those, but then we go through these theological and mental gymnastics to try to say to God, well, you didn't really mean 6 days, did you? The one I toyed with for many years was this one, the day-age theory. Those days could be millions of years. You know, a day in the Lord's like 1,000 years, that passage from 2 Peter. Actually, if you read on, it actually says, and 1,000 years is like a day, so it actually just cancels itself out. But you know, that's talking in context about the patience of God, that he's not willing that anyone should perish. You see, Dr. Hugh Ross here, he says the Hebrew word for day, yom, can mean an indefinite period of time. And it can, he's right. It's the same with the word day in English. And I'll give you an explanation of what he means. But it depends upon the context. See, if I said to you it took me 3 days to drive from Los Angeles to Roswell, how many 24-hour days am I talking about? 3. You automatically understand it. You know why? Because I defined it in context. I used the number 3. But if I made a statement to you and said, whoa, way back in my father's day, how many 24-hour days am I talking about now? You don't know. And if I said to you yesterday morning, am I talking about a yesterday indefinite period of time? A morning's a part of a day, isn't it? And an evening's a part of a day. So when you hear the word evening and morning or something like that in context, you know it's part of a 24-hour day. So what's the context in Genesis? There was evening and morning the first day. There's a number, and there's an evening and a morning. There was evening and morning the second day, evening and morning the third day. Seeing a pattern here, evening and morning the fourth day. And why is it hard for God? We've been talking about the God that's outside of our space and time that brought the universe into being. He could have created in 6 seconds. You know the reason we get hung up with the millions of years? Because we're intimidated by the claims of secular science that start from outside the scripture to start with. And it all came from Lyell and his uniformitarian geology. So just in this first section, folks, I've hit on a few points. Here's a key issue. The Christians here, you will understand. Here's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You know, day 6, God saw all that he had made and it was very good. By the way, angels are created beings. Satan is a created being. He couldn't have fallen before day 6, as a clue, or in the gap, as the Schofield's translation works out. But you know what? Those rock layers, remember I said they're supposed to represent eons of Earth's history? They contain fossils. Fossils are a record of dead things. So you're telling me Adam and Eve would have been standing on a fossil graveyard, a record of death, pain, disease, suffering over millions of years, and God looks down and said, it's very good. There's a theological problem there. Anybody here think death is good? Death stinks. Sorry. You know, in the last 18 months, I've lost my dad and my beautiful sister to cancer. And I can tell you I don't like death. The Apostle Paul writes that it was an intrusion into God's perfect world. The last enemy to be destroyed was death. See, folks, why do bad things happen? Because we live in a sin-cursed world. Now, you might think God was, wrong to do that, but you know what? Death's a blessing. Because we were destined to live forever. Adam and Eve were destined to live eternally in the flesh. But they would have then been eternally separated from God. But it's only now, via the mechanism of death, if you believe in the one whom God sent, the Lord Jesus Christ, you can actually, through death, be reconciled back to your Creator. See, God didn't resort to plan B because He's sovereign. He knew what happened. Folks, the New Testament confirms there was no death and bloodshed before Adam. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, in this way death came to all men because all sinned. People want to know if God's a God of love. Well, folks, you know what? The reality is we're all going to die. Sorry about that bad news, but there's nothing we can do about it, is there? Here we are, we're all on this mud ball spinning in space, and there's nothing we can do to save ourselves. Nothing. But you know what? Even though we messed up God's perfect creation, He sent a rescue mission out of heaven. While we were helpless sinners, Christ died for us, the Bible says. And He saved us. People want to know if God's a God of love, but you know what? Remember I said there was a foundation to all of these things. Doesn't make sense unless you go back to the beginning. So should you take Genesis literally? Folks, if Genesis is not real literal history with a literal very good creation, with a literal Adam and Eve, and if sin did not literally enter the world through their action, here's the problem. Then you and I don't literally need to be saved from anything. The very reason Christ came was because of what happened there in the Garden of Eden. You know, we get hung up on these ages, the days, could they be other periods? But the reality is, well, let me put it this way. You know what? There's no astronomical reason actually why we have a 7-day week. A day is a rotation of the earth. We have a lunar cycle gives us a month, and a solar cycle gives us a year. But the fact that we actually have a 7-day week comes from only one place, from Scripture, and it's a lasting memorial to the Creator. It comes from no other place. So I just wanted to share that at the beginning to show you how some of these things that we've been bombarded with and been taught as fact can actually be interpreted differently. You know, our organisation, I don't say this to boast because, you know, you need to establish people's credentials. You shouldn't just believe what people say. You know, my view is I believe the Bible literally. Why should I interpret it any other way? God meant me to understand it. And our organisation, you heard we've got 7 offices. We employ more scientists than any other Christian organisation in the world. So the stuff I'm telling you is derived as a result of peer review and a think tank, if you like. So let's get on to this subject, understanding where UFOs come from. Because, you know, I suppose there's 3 groups. I've thought about it this way, you see, because what we tend to do, we tend to already come to a conclusion based on our worldview, and then we interpret the data according to that. So let me give you an example. The true UFO believer who believes that, you know, every sighting he'd like to be a real alien spaceship, he is constrained really by his belief system to try to look for the evidence to make that fit his belief system. Now you might get the skeptic. He might believe in evolution on other planets, but he doesn't believe in the feasibility of interstellar travel, so he says every sighting has to be either natural or man-made phenomena, or it's the psychological delusions of people. And then even Christians, what we tend to do, and I want to urge a word of caution, is we take every sighting, we try and attribute a spiritual aspect to it. And the reality is that 90% of all UFO sightings can be explained naturalistically. either man-made or natural phenomena. But you know what? There is a small percentage that is difficult to explain, and we'll talk about some of those. But you know what? Mike Heiser spoke earlier about, you know, sort of our modern culture interpreting this. And you know, Ronald Storr in his book there, The Mammoth Encyclopedia of Extraterrestrial Encounters, 900 pages. It is a real phenomenon, not going away, like Lynn Marzulli said. But he said, look, without having any prior discussions on the matter, I asked my son Brian, what is a UFO? He answered without hesitation, a flying saucer. So I rephrased the question, what's inside a flying saucer? To which he replied, matter-of-factly, people from other planets. Nothing could better illustrate to me that UFO had become a living symbol in our culture for the vehicle that carries humanoids from another planet. See, folks, just think about the influences that we have. Science fiction, evolution. Why is evolution a key? Well, you know what? Life can only get here on Earth by one of two ways, two belief systems. Either it was created or it evolved. So when you look out in this enormous universe, there could be trillions of galaxies and possibly trillions of planets out there. So surely life must have evolved out there as well. You know, I was at a UFO conference in Brisbane, and a UFO investigator got up the front and he said, look, the great cosmic science experiment works. We know that. Here we are, you and I are proof of it. Therefore, in a 14 billion-year-old universe, there could be parts of the universe that might be, alien races that could be 1 billion years older than us. If they're 1 billion years older, they're 1 billion years advanced in their technology, so who's to say they couldn't build hyperdrive spaceships and visit the Earth, for example? You can see how it's an extrapolation there of evolutionary beliefs. The other view, of course, is that God may have created life on other planets, and I'm going to leave that. That's the number one question I get. And because we tend to think, why would he have made it so big if we're the only ones? Well, I believe there are good reasons for that. But, and as I say, I'll leave that till the last question that I answer. I mentioned science fiction. You know what? Go and have a look on movies.yahoo. Generally, depending which of the movies of the time, but around about 70 to 80% of the highest grossing movies of all time are sci-fi. It's the most popular entertainment genre of today, bar none. And you know, those two columns on the left, I just sat there and just thought, well, what about some of the movies? Without even research, I could just remember those off the top of my head, because I'm a sci-fi fan, and there's some of the TV shows. Do you know that Star Trek The Next Generation is the most syndicated watched TV show in the history of this planet? But more people have watched Star Trek Next Generation than Gilligan's Island. Can you imagine that? It's very popular. And we have this fascination with the future. Popular culture imbibes it. I could show you cereal boxes with aliens on them. Here you go, we want to take a drive out to Area 51, the extraterrestrial highway, the government renamed it. There's the speed sign, warp 7 is the maximum speed limit. Go to the end and have a beer at the pub at the Little Ailey Inn. And I actually like this. You've got to laugh at some graffiti guys, haven't you? Look at that, the road sign there. Cattle mutilations and abductions. But see, it's part of popular culture. Look at this town. Popular culture. And there's people only too eager to promote it. Well, you remember a guy called Carl Sagan, arguably the most popular scientist of the modern era. He had a TV show called Cosmos. And if you remember that, if you're a geriatric like me, you know, there used to be the picture of the waves rolling on the shore, and the voiceover said, the cosmos is all that is, ever was, or ever will be. That's what we call a materialistic worldview. Materialism not as in wealth or money, but materialism as in matter is all there is, atoms are all there are, ever will be. But the problem is, for materialists like Sagan, the origin of life is still a mystery. You know, even Darwin, his theory of evolution by natural selection, by the way, natural selection, he actually hijacked, believe it or not. He actually had in his copy while he was on the Beagle a fully fledged version of natural selection by Edward Blythe, who was a creationist. And I'm going to talk about natural selection in a moment. But they still have a mystery. How did life begin? Well, you know, some of the popular views today is that, obviously, you know, the Miller-Urey experiment, amino acids were first formed in a reducing atmosphere, formed the first protein, the first cell, and we, all life on this planet, is descended from a common ancestor. And in fact, this man here, I wrote this article on Sir Francis Crick and James Watson, who won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the DNA molecule back in 1953. Crick there seated was an ardent atheist. He already had a worldview that said there is no God, there's no creator, and one of the reasons he entered university or the sciences, he said, was to disprove the notion of a supernatural creator. So a pre-existing worldview. But when he was confronted with all of this information on the DNA molecule, and I'll talk more about that in a sec, this is what he wrote in a book called Life Itself. He said, "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to have been satisfied to get it going." Wow, he sounds like a creationist, doesn't he? But he's not. So he's confronted with all this information. When you see information, where does information come from? An information provider. Does information spontaneously reorganise itself? Or, something like that? Well, Crick said the aliens did it. And that's something known as panspermia, right? And there's two views of panspermia. There's panspermia, where life may have fallen to the earth by accident from some distant planet. And then there is directed panspermia, where, if you like, aliens have seeded life on Earth. And actually, that's one of the most common messages that people are getting in their visitations, isn't it? Wonder why that is. Because no God is necessary. We're your creators. We're the ones that are going to fix the holes in your ozone and save you from global warming and have nice, warm, homespun stories. Please trust us. Well, let's just have a look at this. Sir Fred Hoyle, famous astronomer, talking about panspermia, not directed panspermia. He says, "I am charmed but not impressed by the picture of life forms developing in warm little ponds protected in their icy igloos from the cruel cold and near vacuum of open space and falling to primitive Earth at speeds exceeding 11 kilometres per second." What's that, about 6.5 miles per second? Oops. So you can see there's a problem. By the way, he's not a creationist either. Hoyle was an evolutionist. But he said the chance that life could have got here by accident was very remote. He said it was actually like filling the universe with people with Rubik cubes and trying to get them all arrive at the same result at exactly the same time. That's how big the chances would be. So now, whether it's indirected, if you like, undirected panspermia or directed panspermia, the idea that some life could get here and evolve, that is we've got to add information to the genome, we've got to get from pond scum to professors, basically, is a problem. See, all life is based upon information. You have trillions of cells in your body all floating around right now, and in the nucleus of every cell is something called this DNA molecule, which is just an information storage system. And there are letters of information there. You actually can look at the letters, and they're all ordered. For example, the simplest living organism on the earth today is a bacterium that has about 580,000 letters of information in its DNA. That's the simplest. And every single letter in that 580,000's worth of DNA, letters worth of DNA, has to be ordered and arranged in exactly the right manner. And if you change the order, guess what? Life does not exist for that bacterium. It can't reproduce. Now, if I could take a single strand of every one of your DNA that's in every one of your cells here, a single strand of your DNA, if I could type out the letters into books, I'd amass a pile of books that would reach 1,000 high. And every letter in 1,000 books worth of information has to be ordered and arranged in exactly the right manner. So what happens for evolution to occur? So remember this, if you think aliens seeded life on Earth, some simple primitive life, you've got to add information. See, we never see information being added to the genome. Never once, never in a laboratory, never in the wild, in the natural world. It doesn't happen. I'm going to show you why. But the first thing, we hear about some simple cell, millions of years ago in a warm pond on Earth. A simple cell? A cell is more complex than a machine. They've actually been described as cities. Cities that have factories in them. And these factories have machines in them. Machines don't come about by chance. They are actually molecular machines. It's non-living material that is, with the information, actually transports material from one part of the cell to the other on highways that's being built as it walks and then being disassembled behind it as it goes. They have temperature-sensitive control mechanisms to avoid overheating, elaborate communication networks within and without the cell, power plants to produce and burn energy and even store energy, and this all manufactured from high precision from raw materials, can reproduce itself in about 20 minutes. I don't know any cities that can do that. When you look at a cell, you're looking at something that is irreducibly complex. a man by the name Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box a few years ago, he said that, you know, when you see an example of irreducible complexity like a mousetrap, the idea is that you cannot remove any components from it and still have it functioning. So, for example, if you looked at the mousetrap, it's designed to catch mice. You have to have all 5 parts there to catch mice. If you remove one component, it ceases to be a mousetrap by definition because it will no longer catch mice, right? So take one part away. That's an example of irreducible complexity. You know what? You cannot take any components apart of the cell. You cannot remove information from DNA and have the same organism that you started with. So let's look at this a bit more. We're going to do a natural selection. Natural selection is a real event. It occurs really out there in nature. Creationists don't have a problem with it. But what happens is evolutionists say natural selection is evolution. So remember as I show you this with the idea that some simple life was seeded here on Earth. I'm going to do a natural selection experiment for the fur length in dogs. I like to use dogs because everybody understands dogs. Most of us have dogs. We have all sorts of different dogs, you know, Great Danes, tall ones, fat ones, little ones, like Chihuahuas, if you can call those a dog, but anyway. So, in fact, you go to the British Natural History Museum, there's a display of dogs, and there's a sign up that says, Darwin says dogs prove evolution. So let's see if that's right. There's about 300 different breeds of dog. Now, just imagine, we try to represent these as these dogs having medium fur length. And the reason they're right in the medium range of fur length is because, hey, the dad here, he's got a gene for short fur and a gene for long fur. So he's got all the information necessary for differing fur lengths, but he's smack bang in the middle because he's got all the information. And the mum here is the same, short fur gene, long fur gene. So when these dogs have puppies, they can produce dogs with short fur. Why? Inherited the short fur gene from dad, short fur gene from mum. You could get dogs with medium length fur, short fur gene from dad, long fur gene from mum, and vice versa. Maybe the long fur gene from dad, but they're still expressed in the middle range, different combination of genes. And then you get this guy here, right? And what's happened? He's inherited the long fur gene from dad and the long fur gene from mum, one set of instructions from each parent. Guess what? Look at the variation in one generation. But guess what happened? All that variation had to come from pre-existing information. It had to come from more information than was passed on to the offspring. So let's say we take this truckload of dogs and we'll go and drop them up into an Alaskan winter, okay? Which ones have a survival advantage? The long-furred dogs, okay, we understand that, so we'll knock these guys out. Now, when these pair reproduce, what will happen now? They'll only reproduce dogs with long fur. So they've adapted, and some would say evolved, to their environment. That's natural selection. The nature has culled out those with unfit characteristics. But here's the key, folks. There's a loss of information. Natural selection always reduces information. And I'm not meaning to offend people here today, but if you think that life could have evolved or was seeded by aliens and you know, with just some simple DNA with all the coding work out, what happens in nature, testable, repeatable, empirical science, it doesn't work. The information heads in the wrong direction. And I said in my book, you'd have to have aliens that created a whole multiplicity of life on Earth, an original kind, just like the Bible says. After his kind, after their kind. Genesis 1 says it 10 times over. A dog kind, a horse kind, a people kind. Look at all the variation of people we have here today. It can be explained easily. Modern genetics has caught up. The DNA molecule has been described as the most complex information storage mechanism in the entire universe. You know how compact and how efficient it is? I think I gave you a clue because I said there's 1,000 books worth of information in a single strand of your DNA. But you know, about the size of a head of a pin. If I could take a single pinhead's worth of DNA and I could type out the letters into books, how high do you think the pile of books might be? Anyone want to have a guess? Anyone? Come on, you're going to get it wrong anyway. Have a bit of fun. Anybody have a guess? To the moon. My goodness. Not even close. In fact, you'd have enough books to reach to the moon and back 240 times in a single strand, in a single pinhead of DNA. And for you computer geeks who don't read books, that's about a pile of CD-ROMs over 1,000 miles high or 40 It's 100 million 40 gigabyte hard drives, okay? This is the God we're talking about. You know, Paul Davies, a physicist, not a creationist. He's Englishman, worked in Australian universities. He's written a lot of books on physics. He said this: how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There is no known laws of physics able to create information from nothing. That's science fact. You know, I'll give you an example. I talked about these letters of information in the DNA. I want you to imagine if I could hold up a copy of my book here tonight, and you see all the letters on the page, all the type. Are the letters themselves information? Sorry, no, they're not. The letters have to be arranged into words and sentences to produce information. See the difference? And whenever you see that complex information code of information, it's a sign that a greater source of information or intelligence put it there. Well, when you read my book, I hope you think so. Anyway. And when we look at the DNA molecule, what do we see? Encyclopedias worth of information written in a code, just like sentences on a page that have to be there. So, you know, our friends the Raelians, I had them follow me around a little bit in Australia for a while, trying to give me their books. You know the Raelians cult? Some years ago, the Raelians claimed they cloned a child. Remember that? They say the Elohim in Genesis, you see? You mistook us for gods. These are the messages channeled from extraterrestrials. The Elohim is really showing the plurality of the Trinity, if you like, 3 in 1. But they're asking these big questions in life. It's a substitute religion. Some years ago, they had this claim, Bridget Bacelia, their lead scientist, she had to appear in a US court because they claimed they'd cloned a child. And they said, produce the child. They said, oh, we've shipped them off overseas. We can no longer do that. And at a UFO meeting in Australia, the Raelians were there and they had their book tables, just like we've got our book tables there. And I went up to this one young man wearing his Rael symbol. And I said, wow, I said, you know, I heard in the press that Rael is very, very happy with all the publicity you're getting. He equated it to about $500 million worth of free publicity. And in a French accent, because apparently they send out missionaries from France or his headquarters, he said, yes, we're very, very happy. We have many people coming to us now. But then he corrected me and he said, could you please not say his name, for he is the Messiah, you see. Now, the message that Rael received was this one. This was his book, The Message Given by Extraterrestrials, but he's had a moment of inspiration and he's renamed it and he now calls it Intelligent Design. So folks, there's just an answer. The intelligent design movement is very popular in this country. That's not enough. Who's the designer? You see? And hopefully I've shown you, even if they say they created life on Earth, but you know, they would have had to have created thousands of different fully formed kinds of animals, and don't believe that's the case. And here's the big issue with all of that. With all of these messages about aliens being our creators, who created them? Is it simplistic? But it's valid, isn't it? So if aliens created us, who created the aliens that created us? And who were the creators of the aliens that created us? And you're just pushing the problem into outer space where you can't solve it. You know, and the people I've met that have had abduction or experiences, you know, I've heard, well, I got a message and they told me that our creators were from the Pleiades. And then I talked to somebody over here and they said, well, our creators were from Orion and over here from Zeta Reticuli. And hang on, it can't all be right, can they? Someone's not telling the truth because they can't all be correct. It's at that level, I believe, you can unpick it. So folks, quite simply, as this little guy says, if Earthlings didn't believe in evolution, I wouldn't exist. You know, when you watch Star Wars and Star Trek and you see all those weird, wonderful creatures, different shapes, etc., actually, what's the unwritten message? Didn't they evolve differently on their countries? Didn't evolution take a different turn? Of course, Star Trek, the prime directive, that's, you know, we don't interfere with a culture until they've developed warp technology. So we see all these cultures at different stages of evolution, for example. Now, I've talked about biological evolution. Aliens couldn't create life on Earth, you know, remember I said the origin of life is still a mystery. But we've got to go back even before that because we've got to have a universe to start with, haven't we? And again, remember I said I met that UFO investigator. He said, we know the great cosmic science experiment works, the Big Bang. Well, let's just ask about this and see what we've learnt, because if there was a Big Bang 14 billion years ago, are we in the realm of operational science or historical science? Which one? Historical science, isn't it? Exactly. Okay, we are not there to see a Big Bang many years ago. Now, I'm going to give you an explanation of the Big Bang. Many people believe in it because it's used so much, that expression. As I said, there's many different forms, but here is the most common view, and I'm simplifying it, and again, not to ridicule, but it's also very accurate. It goes like this: in the beginning there's nothing. But when I say nothing, I'm not even talking about empty space. Space is something. It's a medium. Einstein called it the ether. If you like, it's a medium through which we can transmit light. So there's no space, there's no planets, there's no matter, no atoms, nothing. There's nothing. I can't imagine it, can you? And you know why you and I can't imagine it? Because we're living in a three-dimensional universe, in time and space. We can't understand things beyond that. But anyway, in this nothingness, there's something called a quantum fluctuation. I don't quite know what that is, but it's just something that occurs to create the first kernel of energy, a quantum particle. And in this particle that's, give you an example, no bigger than the head of a pin, all the matter and all the energy and all the space of the entire universe is contained within it. And then for some reason, it suddenly expands. Faster than the speed of light, our universe comes into being. E equals mc squared. Remember that from school? Energy converts to matter. And clouds of dust and gas coalesce to form, stars, galaxies, planets, and ultimately human beings. And that's basically the Big Bang Theory in a nutshell. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to show you a synopsis from Discover magazine. And they had in the magazine, this was on the cover in the magazine, an article by Professor Alan Guth, the father of the inflation theory of the Big Bang. And this is what he said: the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing, zero, nada, and as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff from absolutely nowhere. And I love this cartoon, which says, let me get this straight, first there was nothing and then it exploded. You see, folks, if somebody says to you that the believing in creation is unscientific, well, guess what? They don't even have a physical universe to start with. So you can pretty much invoke anything you like because the laws of physics don't apply. It sounds like almost like witchcraft to me, right? It's magic. So now either there is a supernatural being outside of our universe who brought time and space into being, or matter can suddenly rearrange itself into complex living organisms and it's eternal. But I actually think a very, very good scientific explanation is that God created the heavens and the earth. So let me break this down for you a little bit, because for me personally, this is the most profound statement in all of Scripture. Let me break it down. That's why. It's loaded. In the beginning, God. That tells you someone was there before the universe. Now, of course, it's fair to ask, who made God? But again, you know why you ask that? Because I'm sorry to say it's actually our naturalistic understanding. We cannot understand other dimensions. We cannot understand anything outside of time. Because, put it this way, whether you're a big banger or a creationist, if I was to ask you the question, did the universe have a beginning, what must you answer? Yes, let me explain to you. See, a scientific principle is everything which has a beginning has a cause. Think about that. This building, somebody thought about it, designed it, built it, it had a beginning, it had a cause. You and I have a beginning, and we know what cause does, right? So the universe is real. It must have had a beginning, and therefore it must have had a cause. That is a scientific fact, a scientific principle. Evolutionists start outside of that paradigm. See? Now, the reason it's difficult to understand, just consider again, there's no space. Here's God. The Bible says he inhabits eternity. I used to think that eternity could be billions of years in the past and billions of years in the future. But actually, what's eternity? I sort of come to the understanding it's timelessness. Time does not exist. Time exists for us. You know why? Because time began with the creation of the physical universe. What did I say? What do we use to measure time in our local neighbourhood here? The rotation of the Earth and the solar cycle. And somewhere else they use different measurements of time. You know, we have a Jovian year or something like that. But before the universe began, I don't think time existed. And that's where God is. So why do we say, hey, God, it took you billions of years? Well, there is no time to God. As I say, he could have done it in 6 seconds. You know, it's interesting. We get some great insights from Scripture. In Job 26 there he says, he hangs the earth on nothing. How did Job write that? He couldn't have a space shuttle to go out and look back at the earth and figure that out, could he? And then Isaiah writes, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. The Hebrew word there, kug, translated sphere or globe, something like that. Isn't that interesting? The Bible says in Isaiah 45:18, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. The earth looks like it was made for life, doesn't it? Do you know there's something the scientists call the anthropic principle? Have you heard of that? The anthropic principle basically says that the entire universe, not just the solar system, the entire universe gives the appearance that it's specifically designed for life on Earth. But they don't believe it, but they say that's what it looks like. So how do they get away with that? Well, let me give you a couple of examples first off, and just a couple of simple ones. Our moon is receding from the Earth, a couple of centimetres, half an inch a year or something like that. But you know what? Even a million years ago, it would have been so close to the Earth that we'd have enormous tides that would wash up on the land and recede every day, hundreds of kilometres onto the land. When we look at our position in our solar system, we're what's described in the Goldilocks zone. You heard that before? Just the right distance from the sun. And too close, we fry. Too far away, we freeze. And then we look at our solar system, we appear to be in just the right position in our Milky Way galaxy. Because if we were any so closer to the galactic central bulge, well, we'd all get, zapped by cosmic radiation. So it wouldn't be much fun, and etc. And then even then they say, and our galaxy appears to be just in a nice position in our universe. All by chance, of course. So how do people who say, well, that's what it looks like, but we don't believe it? Again, you see, you start with a materialistic worldview that has to give a naturalistic explanation. Well, they say, well, in the past, there's been infinite universes. Maybe there was a big bang and a big crunch, and a big bang and a big crunch going on endlessly. But in this particular universe you and I live, the dice of evolution just happened to fall in the right number, and they all got going. So that's why we're here to ask the question, why does the universe look like it's been designed in the first place? It's actually a non-answer. It's like you taking poison. I'm saying, how did you survive the poison? And you say, well, if I didn't, I wouldn't be here to answer your question. It doesn't answer the question. That's the problem. And Paul Davies here again. Remember, this guy's not a Christian. I don't quite know what he believes. He sort of thinks that matter has some self-intrinsic properties to reorganise itself or something like that. But he says the temptation to believe that the universe is the product of some sort of design, a manifestation of subtle aesthetic and mathematical judgment, is overwhelming. The belief that there is something behind it all is one that I personally share with, I suspect, a majority of physicists. See, actually, is this an argument about science? It's not, is it? This seems to be actually more of a spiritual matter. Because the only two ways people believe you and I can get here. Either it was created or it evolved. If it's evolved, then you can make up your own rules about life. If it was created, there are implications, aren't there? And you know what? I'm sorry to say, if you believe that it was evolved, you're actually going to stand before the Creator someday and say, you were given information that this universe was not evolved. And Romans 1:20 clearly warns that we are actually without excuse. Do you know why we're without excuse? Because it also says that we can see from what has been made that there is a creator. And why is evolution so subtle? Why am I so passionate about this subject? Because for years I struggled with a materialistic worldview. Did what was right in my own eyes because I was never exposed to this information. That's why I believed in it. Evolution is a very subtle, well, it's actually not so subtle, but it's a lie. That's my belief. That's what I believe. And Charles Darwin himself strongly resisted the idea that you could add evolution to the Bible. He said, it doesn't work. Now, let's have a look at this idea a bit deeper. Because the standard view that most people have, particularly in layman's world out there, of the idea that aliens are really visiting us in their spaceships is what's known as the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the ETH. And it particularly grew in the 50s after, obviously, the explosion in the 40s. The idea of aliens evolving on the planets, other planets, became popular. But as understanding about the enormous size of our universe increased, it became obvious that aliens could not travel thousands or even millions of light years across the universe, requiring multiple generations to make the trip. You know, I'm a Star Trek fan, right? And they have those antimatter propulsion systems, and because when matter and antimatter meet, it's the opposite of E equals mc squared, you get energy again. By the way, do you know that the lack of antimatter is the #1 most serious objection to the Big Bang theory of the universe? Because in that Einstein equation, when energy converts to matter, you should also get an equal amount of antimatter. And we do not see any antimatter anywhere naturally occurring anywhere in the universe. That's why Paul Davies, and he writes that somebody's tinkered with the maths to get the universe, right? But just imagine, you know, you're on this starship, and it's going to require multiple generations. You've got to raise your youngsters up to be nuclear physicists to run the matter-antimatter propulsion systems, right? And they've got to raise their kids up to be nuclear physicists and so on and so forth. And, of course, it is really science fiction. You know, the first time I met Joe Jordan, just after my book was released in Florida, it was a great meeting. Joe's information helped me blow the lid on this in my book. I'll never forget what one Amazon reader wrote. He said, Chapter 7, which is the chapter on abductions, he said was worth the price of the books. He said it was like watching Sixth Sense, the movie. And that was because of Joe's work and his fellow colleagues here. But, you know, when I went to visit him, he lives real near the Space Centre. And I'm pretty envious. He says he could watch from his balcony, you know, the space shuttle take off. And I'm an Apollo junkie from my childhood. And it was like going to Mecca when I finally visited the Kennedy Space Centre. But, you know, when I visited there, I was able to confirm that the Apollo rockets that took man to the moon and the space shuttle are the most powerful vehicles mankind ever built. And you can see their top speed there. Do you know that the fuel pump on the space shuttle is so powerful it could empty the average backyard swimming pool in about 25 seconds? If you could convert their energy that they burn, or produce rather, for 2 minutes, just imagine the energy produced in 2 minutes by their solid rocket boosters. If I could convert that to electrical energy, I'd have enough fuel to power 87,000 homes for a full day. Just 2 minutes. And yet, at the best speed Apollo could produce, unfortunately, it doesn't get us anywhere near fast enough to get around even our own galaxy. At the best speed of Apollo, it would take 870,000 years to reach the next nearest star to us, Proxima Centauri. That's about 4.3 light years away. So if you want to get around the universe, you need some craft like this, right? Okay, time to come out of the closet, all the Trekkies. Reveal yourself. Yeah, I feel like I'm in Friends. I do that in churches. Not many people put their hands up. Well, live long and prosper. Anyway, these guys travel at warp speed, much faster than the speed of light, of course. The speed of light is 300,000 kilometres per second, 186,000 miles per second. Well, a lot of people think because you're in space and you're weightless, that it's easy to get around. It's not the same energy requirements as you have on Earth, but it's not like that. Just imagine if I was up there on the International Space Station and, you know, Mission Control radioed up and said, "Hey, Gaza," because that's my nickname in Australian, "can you get out the spacesuit, mate? I want you to get outside. We need you to push the space shuttle, the space station, a couple of feet to the left." Now, do you think I'd be able to do that? But the space station is weightless, isn't it? So am I, exactly right. Same laws of physics apply. What would happen? You'd see me going backwards. So just imagine this. Let's go through. If I wanted to propel a 500-gram ball, now what's that? That's about a pound, 1 pound in weight, to just half the speed of light, represented there by C, it would take 4,000 years, 4 million years to reach Andromeda, the next galaxy to my own. right? It would take the energy requirements to get to that speed of 98 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, just a 1-pound ball. Now, when I get to my destination, because once I get out in space and get going, I'll just keep going at that speed. So I've got to slow myself down. I've got to use the same energy requirements again to slow myself down, and then I've got to use the same energy requirements to speed up for the return trip, and when I get to the Earth to slow down again. That's 4 times the energy requirements just to propel something like a 500-gram ball. And so what sort of energy requirements would you need to produce to fuel those city-sized craft? Now let's go on. I know some of you might be thinking, well, you know, if there were races out there that were technologically advanced, couldn't they do these things? We just don't understand what could be developed. Well, I'll get to that in just a moment. There are other problems. There's 100,000 dust particles for every cubic kilometre of space. Now, 1/10 of the speed of light, the impact would be like 10 tonnes of TNT going off inside your spaceship. A pea-sized object would produce enough kinetic energy equivalent to 2.2 atomic bombs. Now, of course, science fiction to the rescue, because what does the Starship Enterprise have? It has deflector arrays, right? But you know what? You've got to detect a grain of dust 9 trillion kilometres away every second to try to avoid it. Wow, pretty clever. Have a look here. Here's just a couple of panels on the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, it hasn't done a lot of damage, but can you see the impact marks? And that thing's just sitting in our atmosphere in geosynchronous orbit. There's a lot of stuff in space. It's not empty. This is a window of the former Space Shuttle Challenger. 1983, a flake of paint, 0.2 of a millimetre in size. That's about the size of a pinhead. Caused that gouge in the window of the Space Shuttle. $50,000 to replace the window. It's a pretty expensive glazing bill, isn't it? Other problems, G-forces. 1G is equivalent to Earth's gravity. And I suppose you've been to the theme parks, you've ever driven roller coasters and felt the acceleration, the deceleration, that's G-forces. Do you know Air Force pilots have to undergo special training to actually constrict their muscles, to try to constrict their blood flow so they don't pass out when they pull, you know, very fast turns, you know, 8, 9 Gs, etc. So can you imagine changing directions at the speed of light or even faster? You know, Captain Jean-Luc Picard says, make it so, and you accelerate into sort of warp speed, you'd be exerting millions of Gs upon the occupants. But you've got to have those types of speeds to try to get here. Well, again, Star Trek, science fiction to the rescue. What do they have on the Enterprise? Inertial dampers. See, there we go. So you don't get splattered up the walls when they do U-turns at warp factor 9, etc. There's other problems. Cosmic radiation. Do you know every time you fly in a plane, you actually get zapped with a little increased dose of cosmic radiation. It's minor, it's harmless. Mind you, I've taken about 200 plane trips in the last couple of years, so that's probably what's wrong with me. But you know, we don't know what would happen as your speed increases out in space. In fact, it's one of the biggest problems that they're facing with extended manned missions to Mars, etc., is the exposure to cosmic radiation. So as you are travelling at the speed of light or faster, your exposure is going to be just enormous dosages and it'd likely fry you. And here's the single biggest problem within our time-space universe, and that is Einstein said, and there's good demonstrable scientific experimental evidence to show that he's right, because you remember at school when you did your physics classes, as your speed increases, your mass increases, right? So as you approach the speed of light, your mass becomes infinite. You've actually got to convert every atom in the universe to energy to try to get yourself to the speed of light. So in other words, it's impossible. Now again, people are saying, well, okay, what about the future? What about future technologies? Folks, I'm sorry, you cannot defy the laws of physics. You can develop technologies to work within the laws of physics. You cannot work outside the laws of physics. You are bound. They are fixed, immutable laws that you and I live in. If we didn't have gravity as an immutable law, you'd be floating off all over the place. You can't switch them off. I talked about the speed of light. I don't have time to talk about how we can see distant starlight, millions of light years away, in a young Earth creation. But we've got books out there, Starlight and Time by Russ Humphreys, and he's just put a paper on our website to develop that a little bit more. Just the clue is that when you hear the expression a light year, it's not a measurement of time. It's a measurement of distance. It's an expression used to define distance. But let me just give you a quick clue, and we know this works. Gravity can distort time. And so he has a creation model where the Earth which in fact redshifts now show that we are actually somewhere physically near the centre of the universe, that while we are near the gravity well, where all the mass is at the time of creation, that in an expanding universe, at the event horizon of an expanding universe, you could virtually get billions of years worth of processes occurring while literally a day passes on Earth, because our time dilation effects here on Earth would cause our clocks to run very slow. Now please note, I'm not saying the universe is billions of years old, because the time frame reference of the Bible is where? Earth. 1 day, 2 days, etc. That's the time frame reference for the universe. So that's what we need to remember. Also why I don't think billions of years is there. Dr. John Hartnett, his new book, and remember, I'm not saying these guys are right, but what I'm showing is that these are good scientific, rational, theoretical models put forward to show that it's possible. This is a new one, Starlight Time and the New Physics. And John Hartnett at University of Western Australia, it's quite amazing. He's actually paid by the Australian government to basically destroy the Big Bang. And you know that this year they held the second Crisis in Cosmology conference in this country. There's an article on our website about it, because over 200 scientists have signed an open letter to Nature now saying we need to get rid of the Big Bang. It doesn't work, it's untenable. Okay? So there are some explanations there. I suggest you can go to our website. So quite simply, if aliens are not physical aliens, are not visiting us from other planets because of the laws of physics and the different problems with space travel, remember the worldview, the belief desires the aliens to be true. Therefore, let's figure out a way that they can get here some other way. And they developed something known as the interdimensional hypothesis, which is the most popular view today of how extraterrestrials allegedly get here. Let me give you an example. I was in Canada, came home from a meeting, switched on the TV, and I was watching a cable station, a sci-fi channel, and there was a lady sitting in a chair channeling a message from an alien being. And the interviewer said to this lady, actually, she believed she was alleged to be talking to an alien, if you like, possessing this woman's body. She said, "You earthlings don't understand. We've evolved to such an extent we don't need vehicles anymore. We can just go wherever we want." And she said, "And if you tried to touch me, my atoms move so fast that your hand would actually pass through my body." And again, I'm not trying to be ungracious or anything, but if you know anything about the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold matter together, that's just, I know we'd say in Australia, rubbish, garbage, wrong, trash. It can't happen. And I don't care what you believe might happen in the future. Again, those laws of physics hold atoms and matter together. But what's happened, this interdimensional hypothesis has now sort of really taken on a religious significance, because it's showing that, you know, aliens say we're going to evolve to some higher transcendental state. You know, Barbara Marciniak of the Pleiadians, she says, you know, the Christians are going to get taken off the earth in some sort of rapture-type theology to allow Mother Earth to evolve into her next transcendental level. The word evolve is underlining that we can also evolve spiritually, for example. I just want to caution here, Christians, when you hear things like the string theory. Okay, I've written articles about this on our website. In fact, 3 days ago I wrote an article, or I wrote a long time before that, but it appeared 3 days ago, about multiverses, multi-universes. Let me just say there is not one shred of scientific evidence to suggest this. They're trying to solve the problems of the Big Bang by resorting to more and more esoteric and elegant mathematics. Okay? But what happens is people, even well-meaning Christians, think, wow, string theory. This could actually tell us that there are multiple dimensions in which we exist. They could be those spiritual dimensions. Well, I believe the Bible talks about a spiritual dimension. You might have compartments in that dimension, but I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to the idea that there are multiple dimensions to our existence. So here's a quote from the book that I wrote, just to sum it up. The common denominator of both camps, the interdimensional or the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is the belief that evolution has occurred for countless eons all over the earth, all over the universe. This point cannot be emphasised strongly enough. It is the basis for virtually all belief in alien life, whatever form that life might take. But then we've still got to answer what's going on with all of these encounters. I'm sure you know about the Washington UFOs. seen on 3 separate radar installations, buzzed the Capitol Dome, and then the US Air Force went up and they disappeared from view, just vanished. So the Air Force landed, out came the lights again, played cat and mouse. Mexico City, arguably the most well-documented, most watched UFO event in history, where these silvery, shiny-looking metallic craft hovered in downtown Mexico City, dozens of video cameras, thousands of people witnessed to the event. No explanation by the Mexican government as to what happened. They quite openly admitted they don't know what it is. By the way, in Australia we say, when you get and it's the same here, when you get an increased flap or sightings of UFOs, it's called a flap or a wave, right? So isn't that the original Mexican wave right there? It's a UFO wave, isn't it? So there we go. You didn't get that. Okay. What about this? Messages from beings claiming to endorse an alternative view of origins. Right back there. See, that book is foundational. Genesis talks about the beginning of things. It talks about our Christian doctrine, our need for salvation. Destroy that book and the rest will just topple like a house of cards. Remember I said, where does the truth begin? This lady, I communicated with her over email. She claims to be a Christian, but she's had these experiences. UFOs parted the Red Sea. Elijah was raptured into a spacecraft. Moses was spoken to in the burning bush from a radio transmitter beamed down by the mothership, And where did she get those ideas from? Well, I'm sad to say she was actually having experiences, needed some help, and she went off to see a man by the name of the Reverend Dr. Barry Downing. Heard of him? He's, I don't know if he still is, but he was the former chaplain to MUFON, I think. Mutual UFO Network, the largest organisation, clearinghouse for UFO investigations and reports. So he thinks angels build these things. Well, remember I said no two look exactly alike? Do you know, we can get up to and have had up to 150 sightings every day. They'd have to be building a lot of them, wouldn't they? See, she said she was a Christian, believed the Bible, and I thought, really? That's unusual, because usually these things are always centred on discrediting the Bible, as we've seen from other lecturers here in the last couple of days. So as I talked to her more and more, then it became down. She says, I even believe the Bible's the Word of God. And I thought, wow, I don't know how to deal with this. But as we got on, she said, oh, well, hang on. She said, we actually haven't got all the Bible. The bits about aliens and UFOs have actually been removed, and they're apparently locked up in the Vatican basement in a conspiracy between the US government and the Catholic Church. So the reality was she actually didn't really believe the Bible was the Word of God, you see. Why did she interpret it like that? And here's the key, here's the power in this phenomenon. It's because of the experience. The reason I focused on worldviews, to say we all have one, is the experience, which can be real, becomes your filter now and your worldview. You interpret your reality now based upon your experience. The experience can be real. But here's a danger, because if you're dealing with a time or a dimension or a being that you have no knowledge of, you need to be careful. See, I can hold this up here, and let's say if I, by sleight of hand, made my pointer disappear, you have enough knowledge of our time-space dimensions in the world you live in. You know, I actually can't make matter disappear, right? So you were more able to say, how did he do that? What was the trick? But if a little grey entity stands at the bottom of your bed in the middle of the night and says, I'm from Zeta Reticuli, or wherever it is, well, how do you know that? How do you test that claim? And you know, the claims of our visitors who are supposed to be here benevolently looking after us, and maybe you heard Joe this morning and you heard that they're not very benevolent, are they? And they lie. If they're highly evolved beings here to look after us, why do they tell us things that we demonstrably know are not true? It's not in keeping with highly evolved benevolent beings, is it? Remember Dr. Jacques Vallée? One of the guy I've got a lot of time for. He doesn't have anything to do with the UFO movement anymore, because I think he believes it's been hijacked by the New Age movement. Belief in the reality of UFOs is spreading rapidly at all levels in society throughout the world. Books and periodicals appear at an ever-increasing rate. Documentaries and major films are now being made by young people of the UFO generation, young men and women who were born just after World War II, who grew up with flying saucer stories, who have moved into influential positions in the media. Who are some of those people? Steven Spielberg. Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft. The Paul Allen Array at SETI Institute is going to be named after him. Hewlett and Packard have donated money to SETI, for example. Folks of my generation, remember that movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind? for me, one of the most influential movies on me as a young man growing up and not a Christian. Dr. Jacques Vallée, the Frenchman, the lead character in that movie, was actually based on Dr. Jacques Vallée. And of course, the bulk of the movie was devoted to this man's work, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And if you watch the movie again, he makes a little cameo at the end when the spaceship lands and they make contact. That movie, I say, was influential as me, as a young man growing up with a materialistic worldview. I remember going home after the drive-ins on little country lanes, thinking, I wish they'd just come and take me like that lucky man Richard Dreyfuss when he went there. I wish that was me. And it's become a substitute religion. A sociologist by the name of Gerald Eberlein has shown that people who are given over to this movement are particularly susceptible to religious ideas, and for them it's become a substitute religion. But you know, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Hynek. He was a real physical scientist. As you know, he investigated different projects for the US government, started his own organisation, CUFOS. And he said this: certainly the phenomenon has psychic aspects. I don't talk about them very much to a general audience because the words psychic and occult have bad overtones. They say, oh, it's all crazy. But the fact is, there are psychic things. For instance, he says, UFOs materialise and dematerialise. There are people who've had UFO experiences. Sorry, the picture's cut out some words, I've just realised that, who claim to have developed psychic ability. There have been reported cases of precognition where people had foreknowledge or forewarning they were going to see something. There's been a change of outlook, a change of philosophy of persons' lives. And you see, those are rather tricky things to talk about openly. But it's there. Many people like Jacques Vallée and I feel to some extent it might be a conditioning process. They're right, aren't they? They're exactly right. You see, the reason I respect Dr. Hynek, even though he was a physical scientist, he used words like, you know, paranormal, paraphysical. You know, he didn't start off from the same worldview as me, but I might use another word to describe that same phenomena: supernatural, spiritual. Why? Because my worldview tells me already that there is a spiritual dimension to this universe, this existence. How do I know that? Because how did the universe come into being, so on and so on. See how it starts back with your origins, your view of origins. You know, you can't go to those other realms. I believe this is an interdimensional issue we're dealing with, and we are being visited by beings from another dimension. You and I can't go to that dimension. We're stuck here. But these beings can obviously come between the two, and we've had a really important visitor from another dimension, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is from another place. He said that when he was standing before Pilate, facing death, facing crucifixion. He didn't waver. And in that transfiguration event, you know, when he stands there and a light came and the voice from heaven said, you know, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. His disciples said, we didn't follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. You know, folks, if Jesus is the creator of the universe, it's God in the flesh. Hebrews says when you look at Jesus, you are looking at the exact representation of his being God. If you want to know what God was like in the flesh, he says, look at Jesus. He was the only sinless man to walk the face of the earth. That's why he's the only one that could pay the price for our rebellion. And you know, if he is the creator as the Bible describes, why do we get hung up on this 6 days? And as I said, it could have been 6 seconds. But you know what? He could change water into wine, and he did at the wedding at Cana. That's a party trick, isn't it? If you're the creator of the universe. You know, science shows men don't rise from the dead. One of the most well-documented events in history is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. How do you explain that? How can God do that? How can men rise? How can he raise men from the dead? Because he's the author of life. He has the power over life and death. You know, and Jesus gives us a heads up. In Matthew 28, for false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that was possible. Who are the elect? The church. Some people say, well, that means it's not possible. I actually disagree. Lots of Christians believe in evolution. And as I say, I think that takes the focus off our incredible, omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient God. Great signs and miracles. Could that be alluding to some of the incredible things that we see in the skies today? Manifestations that seem to be miraculous? Well, the nature of UFOs, you know, they've been seen throughout history, haven't they? They've changed shape over history. The American Indians, for example, they said they saw flying canoes with occupants on board, and the ancient Romans and Greeks saw flying shields with people on board. Seen on radar by multiple credible witnesses, they can materialise, dematerialise, change shape, etc. Animals are spooked, just like you saw in the movie Close Encounters. Do you know, 1896, 1898, there was the airship waves in this country, and they looked like the forerunner of those airships that were just about to appear on the American landscape that had already been appearing in Europe. It does appear that they appear to the cultural understanding of the day. So I want to give you an example, and again, think about the worldview influences that cause us to interpret things different ways. I mentioned what a 5-year-old boy thinks a UFO is. Just imagine 150 years ago, a farmer is standing in his field and he sees some strange lights moving around like they're guided intelligently. How does he interpret that? Because he's never seen a car, a rocket, a spaceship. He doesn't understand that technology. So he might say, well, maybe my eyes are playing up, I need glasses, or maybe it's an angel or a demon, because people were more religiously disposed in those days. But let's shift forward 150 years to today. Somebody sees some lights moving around in the sky, and they look up and they say, I think I've just seen a, what? UFO. And UFO doesn't mean unidentified flying object anymore, does it? It means alien spaceship with people from another planet. And why? Because of science fiction. NASA spending billions of dollars looking for life on other planets. Why? They want to find some microbes on Mars to try to find out how life arose on Earth. Yet the Earth is full of life everywhere, encyclopedias worth of information on the DNA of every creature, and we can't figure it out. Starting from the wrong premise. Some of those shapes, of course, the most common shape today, it appears, is this triangle shape. If any of my colleagues and friends here have a theory on why that is, I genuinely would like to hear it. Here's one, 1957, New Mexico. Has there been an explanation to that one? I don't think there has, but it's a great photo, isn't it? Didn't make any sound as it moved. They appeared there as balls of light. So you see, I can't lasso a UFO and pull it in and do an empirical test on it, right? So you interpret it according to your belief system. But you know, it's at this area and this growing phenomenon of alleged alien abductions where I believe we can unpick it. I gave one explanation. Listen to the stories. They contradict each other. They can't all be true. They lie. But obviously, researchers use something known as the classic abduction syndrome. You've heard of that, the CAS. There's a pattern of 8 markers. You know, there's a capture at night driving a car, or maybe you're in your room, something happens, an examination aboard the ship, telepathic conferences, a tour. We go on, maybe you're taken to other worlds. A theophany, you meet a divine being. Joe said, you know, Rail, for example, he thinks he's met Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad on the spacecraft. They're all living together in peace and harmony, and you Christians have just got to get rid of your old fuddy-duddy ways. They're returned, and often they don't have any conscious recollection of their experiences, but they show markings and suffer post-traumatic stress. And as you saw in the video, often they go off to UFO researchers to find out what's happened. Of course, it'll always be interpreted as, hey, you had a real alien visitation. Well, let's have a look at the nature of abductions. It says entities can pass through walls or suddenly appear in the room. Experiences are controlled, have no control of the situation. Say no conscious recollection of events, injuries, markings. Similarities to out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. People have claimed, you know, that they've appeared above the operating table, or, you know, they've died for a few moments and they see the big white light and they see their dead relatives standing on the other side with aliens next to them. What's going on there? And they make predictions of a future global chaos too. Well, here's a quote, and again, see, when you read my book, you don't have to believe little Joe Christian here, because my book, if you like, is the collation of other people's work. And I'm going to there's a reason I say that, because often some people, they don't give you all the information. But here's Donna Higby, one of leading abduction researchers, does hypnosis, etc. Look what she has to say. And again, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if she's a Christian, but I believe she would probably be hostile to my Christian explanation. She says, I noticed a drastic change in the attitude of several of the abductees from one meeting to the next. People who had been traumatised all their lives by ongoing abductions had only anger and mistrust for their non-human abductors, suddenly started saying they'd been told, shown that everything that happened to them was for their own good. The abductors are highly spiritual beings helping them to evolve spiritually. There's that word, evolve again. She says, by accepting this information, and the abductees stopped fighting abduction, instead became passive and controlled. When I checked with other researchers, I found this was a pattern repeating itself over and over again around the countries. I became concerned that abductees are accepting these explanations from entities that we know can be deceitful. You ever had a situation where one of your friends lies to you? Yeah, it's actually, you never thought about that? If somebody lies to you, they're a liar. Why would you want to trust beings that are demonstrably known to be deceitful, lying? It's not recommended to take anything else at face value. You know, she says abductees became passive and controlled. Most people are traumatized, but the isolation of the experience ends up with them being given over to their abductor's cause. That's something known as Stockholm Syndrome. Heard of that before? Where you find empathy with your abductors or your captors. A classic example in this country, most people remember, is Patty Hearst, when she was kidnapped by a terrorist group and then robbed a bank with them. Lynn Cato, senior bibliographer at the Library of Congress. A large part of the available UFO literature is closely linked with mysticism and the metaphysical. It deals with subjects like mental telepathy, automatic writing, and invisible entities, as well as phenomena, that should be, like poltergeist manifestations and possession. Many of the UFO reports now being published in the popular press recount alleged incidents that are strikingly similar to demonic possession and psychic phenomena that have long been known to theologians and parapsychologists. Wow, sounds like it's been around for a while. Jacques Vallée showed in his book that people who had encounters with fairies were given otherworldly journeys and taken off, and there were also accounts of sexual exploitation in those. But see, if a little fairy or a being claiming it was a fairy stood at the bottom of somebody's bed in the middle of the night today, well, the person would probably doubt their own sanity, because in this enlightened age we don't believe in things like fairies, do we? But you know what we will believe in? We will believe that that being has defied the very laws of physics, travelled from a galaxy far, far away, has chosen you in your bedroom, and out of all the galaxies in the universe, and you are special, you are chosen. John Keel, sort of paranormal New Age researcher, he's written books on UFOs. Look what he says. In case you don't know him, his most famous one was the Mothman Prophecies, which was made into a book. He says the devil and his demons can, according to the literature, manifest themselves in almost any form, can physically imitate anything from angels to horrifying monsters with glowing eyes. Strange objects and entities materialize and dematerialize in these stories, just as the UFOs and their splendid occupants appear, disappear, walk through walls, and perform other supernatural feats. He goes on and says demonology is not just another crackpotology. Thousands of books have been written on the subject, many of them authored by educated clergymen, scientists and scholars, and uncounted numbers of well-documented demonic events are readily available to every researcher. Can I just stop there before I read on? Because this is the bit that rattles my cage. Because when I started looking into this, you know what? He's saying it's readily available to every researcher. Every researcher. So how come when you read the UFO literature, it's not there? Because it does not fit in with their worldview that they want these beings to be ETs from another planet. And therefore, when you read that literature, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot make an informed decision about what it is. You're not being given all the information. You know, when somebody gives you a half-truth, you know what it actually is? It's a half-lie. For the same reason, you haven't got all the information. He goes on and says, and the manifestations and occurrences described, and he called it an imposing literature. There's tons of it out there. Are similar, if not entirely identical, to the UFO phenomenon itself. Victims of demonomania suffer the very same medical and emotional symptoms as the UFO contactees. I talked about the meaning of these things, the origins, the foundational meanings. The Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. It tells us about the beginning. This one, unlike any other history book, tells us about the end. Do you know what? The devil, Satan, Lucifer literally means being of light or bearer of light. It says he masquerades as an angel of light, light being synonymous with everything that is supposed to be good and pure and holy about God. No wonder he could deceive people in the garden. But do you know what? This book tells us the end, as I said. And the devil knows his fate, doesn't he? He can read it just like you and I. He's an intelligent, powerful being. He knows his fate. So what's going on? Because right back there at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, a cosmic war began. And Satan knows his end. Genesis 3:15 says, you will strike his heel and he will crush your head. You're doomed, mate. That's what God said to Lucifer. So he's on a crash and burn policy. He wants to take as many down with him as he can. Who does he want to take down? Us. Why is he so interested in us? Because we are the apple of the Creator's eye. He made this earth and this universe, believe it or not, for us and for himself. I'll get to that in a moment. And he is trying to spite his Creator. That's exactly what he's trying to do. 1 Timothy 4:1 warns us, the Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. There's a heads up, church. Don't be deceived by experiences, signs and wonders. What's going to be your filter for that? How do you determine whether it's true? You can only determine it's true if you've got a source of information from the one who is outside our time-space universe and can tell you what's going on in these other dimensions. Look what Dr. Jacques Vallée said. And again, I'm not sure, my understanding, he's not a Christian, the way that I would understand it. He says, I propose the hypothesis there is a control system for human consciousness. What takes place through close encounters with UFOs is control of human beliefs, control of the relationship between our consciousness and physical reality, that this control has been enforced throughout history, that it is of secondary importance, that it should now assume the form of sighting of space visitors. It's the old age phenomenon dressed up in the emperor's new clothes. A Christian apologist, John Ankerberg, teamed with ufologist John Weldon. I like the way they sum it up. How credible is it to think that literally thousands of extraterrestrials would fly millions or billions of light years simply to teach New Age philosophy, deny Christianity and support the occult? Why would they consistently lie about things which we know are true? Why would they purposely deceive their contacts? Good questions. And then here we're given another heads up. In Galatians 1:8 it says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than one we preach to you, let him be eternally condemned. There's actually a warning that fallen angels could come and preach an alternate gospel to you. Has there been any precedent for that? Well, I believe there is in the so-called experiences that people have. But you know what? Do you know a guy called Joseph Smith? He's the father of the Mormon religion, isn't he? He had what I've coined the visitor experience. You need extra biblical revelation. You need to go and sort out the apostate church. Who is the apostate church? The evangelicals. They got it wrong. Here is more. Actually, the Bible's warning is very clear in the end of Revelation. Do not add or take away from this word. And then there was another man named Muhammad. He had the visitor experience too, didn't he? Meditated in a cave for 6 months, and his ramblings and writings were written down on bits of bones and parchment. There's even some debate amongst Islamic scholars today as to when that was collated into the Quran. And there you've got two of the biggest cults in the world. You know what's a very common denominator in those types of cults, the same way we see in the UFO cults? Polygamy, multiple partners. In the UFO cults, people give their wives over, their children over to these leaders because they think that the intimacy of having an encounter with a divine being is going to be somehow beneficial to them. What happens when you die and you go to be with Allah? You're going to go to paradise and you're going to have lots of virgins and sex again. Sex is a way of controlling people. Nothing new under the sun, Solomon said. I'm not part of the reproductive hybrid explanation on spacecrafts and elaborate things. I've always found the simplest explanations are the best. It's a form of abuse. The same way people are controlled today, verbally, physically, sexually. It's a method of control to get people to play their game. Now, I just want to deal with this issue of whether God could create life on other planets, because the major thing is, again, we look out there and we say it's so big. Why would he have made it so big if we're the only life that exists? Look what Paul Davies said. Christianity in particular has difficulties with regard to the special role that Jesus Christ plays. If they wish to retain Jesus Christ as the Saviour, is he the Saviour of mankind only or of all sentient beings throughout the universe? Because he already presumes it exists based upon his evolutionary beliefs. Or will each community have its own saviour? Doesn't it start to become a little ludicrous? Well, let's have a look. First thing I want to say is many people often comment, well, Gary, the Bible is silent about aliens, therefore they might exist. That's actually an argument from silence. And it actually makes more sense to say, well, if the Bible's silent about something, it might be because they don't exist. But I believe if we look at the big picture of the gospel, we can actually determine whether intelligent ETs exist. Now, let me just make a distinction here. If I saw a dolphin swimming in, or if we found a dolphin swimming in the sea on Europa, I don't think that would falsify Scripture. But see, if I believe the Bible to be the truth, the very words of God, I should not be worried that it can be falsified on things that I demonstrably know are black and white and right in the Scriptures. So I know some people have a genuine motivation, and I've been asked, and they want to put ETs in the Bible somewhere because their concern is, you know, if one steps out, a real one, I'm not talking about a fallen angel, demonic manifestation, if a real ET comes out, lands on the White House lawn, shakes the president's hand, that would destroy my faith. Well, you know what? It would. But it's not going to happen because I know the Bible's true. So let's just think about that, because if God did create intelligent ETs elsewhere in the universe and they were capable of building, you know, warp drive, hyperdrive spaceships, whatever, to get here, it would require a level of intelligence not found in simple animals like bunny rabbits or something on other planets. They'd have to make decisions of what would be right or wrong. They'd be not only self-aware but intelligent. They'd have to be able to make decisions that are moral. What's good for them, what's not good for them, right? Let's not all eat each other, for example. That's a moral decision. By the way, morality comes from the Bible. Humanistic worldview can't give you a moral code. So just think, if they were visiting the earth, that would be breaking God's dominion mandate, which we call in Genesis 1:28. Man was given dominion over the earth. Go and subdue the earth. He made us the bosses here, and he put us on the earth here for our benefit. So advanced aliens with the technology to visit earth would in fact have dominion over man. I don't believe God goes back on his mandate, his promises. I think that's just one thing to consider. But Romans 8:21-22 tells us the whole creation groans and travails under the weight of sin. When you hear the word the creation, or in the beginning, you know, the heavens and the earth, it's what's called a merism. And it rightly means it's an all-inclusive statement. It means everything. Everything that exists. So the whole creation groans and travails under the weight of sin. So just imagine if poor Mr. Spock is sitting out there on the planet Vulcan. Vulcans now get cancers and they're going to die because of what happened here on Earth. Folks, the curse was actually universal. There's no unfallen parts of the universe, I'm afraid. I know it's universal because in the end God tells me he's going to wrap up this heavens and earth, this creation, like a scroll, going to be destroyed in a fervent heat, and he's going to make a new heavens and a new earth, isn't he? So that's what I know. So that's a bit unjust. God is always just. So let's go. When God came to this earth, he came as a man. He came not only to redeem mankind to himself, here's the scripture references, but his creation back to himself. He's been described as our kinsman redeemer. He's our brother also. Okay? The Bible tells us you've got to be basically a human being to be saved. Hebrews 2:17, it's not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. The church has been described and is Christ's bride, right, for eternity. Jesus is not a bigamist or polygamist and going to have lots of brides throughout the universe. Okay? You know, when he was on the cross, if you like, and he was born, or the church was born out of the wound of Christ's side, it's analogous to what happened in the Garden of Eden, where Eve was born out of Adam's side. The Bible calls Jesus the last Adam because there was a real physical, historical first Adam. As I said, you've got to be a physical descendant of Adam to be saved. We go on. As I said, the heavens are going to be destroyed by fire or a fervent heat. So aliens who've not been affected by the curse through no fault of their own, who cannot be saved, are now going to be destroyed when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. That would make God morally wrong. And I don't believe he's capable of being morally wrong. And here it is. The Bible says Christ died once for all. He's not going to be crucified, raised again on other planets, and have lots of brides. The Bible's big picture, I believe, discounts the idea of sentient, intelligent alien life. Now, I don't think you're going to find a dolphin swimming on Europa. I don't think that is consistent, but I'm saying I don't think that would falsify the Bible, but I don't think that will ever happen. We might find bacteria on Mars or some other places, but you know what? We've been sending probes there for years. Who's to say that we didn't contaminate the place? So why is the universe so big? Why did God make it so big? Isn't it an awful waste of space? You're looking at one of the most downloaded photos of the NASA website, the Eagle Nebula. And this guy here, let me tell you, is about 7,000 light years from Earth, 9.6 trillion kilometres in length, and it's just in a little corner of our Milky Way galaxy. Of our universe. And the Bible tells us God is everywhere at the same time. You know why the universe is so big? The Bible tells you several times over. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. Do you know what? I said at the beginning of this talk that I was challenged when I was confronted with this phenomena. And I had to try to wrap my mind around the size of the universe to say, well, could ETs get here, all this type of stuff? But you know, you deal with some very disturbing stuff, but in fact, one of the things is I've actually had a great blessing. Because the Bible tells me when I look up there, rather than thinking about what else might be out there, I should be thinking about the one that made it all. That incredible creator, beyond our space and time, who says even the very hairs on your head have been counted. How can he do that? Because he's the creator. You know, logically, if God's the one that made the universe, it's not big to him. You are using an anthropomorphic answer. In other words, you are saying, well, he wouldn't have. You know what? It's not about what he could have done, might have done, would have done. It's about what he said he did. And he made that, and he made it for himself to display who he was. Just think about this. Remember Abraham in Genesis? God says to Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. I was fascinated by that because, you know, probably New Mexico is a good example, but in the Australian outback, if you don't suffer from light pollution, you can look up and count the stars. You ever done that? It's incredible, isn't it, when you get out of the cities? Do you know, you can only count about 9,000 stars with the naked eye. That's all. So I thought, wow, that's not very much. I don't know whether Abraham bothered counting them to find out, but he repeats the promise to Abraham. He says, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, like the grains of sand on the seashore. And do you know that astronomers have said there's probably as many stars in the universe as there are grains of sand on the earth? In other words, they're innumerable. You know, if you could start counting now. If you could count 100 stars for every second of your life, you wouldn't get anywhere near close. You wouldn't be able to live long enough. And the Bible says he determines the number of stars, and he calls or each of them by name, gives everyone a name. Isn't that amazing? So what can we learn from this today? Here's where the rubber hits the road. Only the Creator can have the power to save you, ladies and gentlemen. You can put your belief in hypothetical aliens to come and visit us. Do you know what? If they really exist, how come no one's been up on the spaceship and brought back a towel from the bathroom or a book of matches? You're dealing with a supernatural entity. The Bible tells us the Word, Jesus, became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Folks, we need to be wearing the right set of glasses. Even as Christians, don't be deceived by experiences. Don't multiply explanations unnecessary. Use the Bible as your filter, your worldview for truth. My worldview starts with creation. God's the creator. 6 days, a few thousand years ago, no death before the fall. Remember I spoke about that? Remember, the millions of years came from the rock layers. They contain fossils, and it puts death before the fall. We can talk about dinosaurs. Where do they come from? I don't fit them in the Bible. I use the Bible to describe dinosaurs. Noah's flood, UFOs. My Christian worldview is predicated on this. There was good creation, corruption entered, a catastrophe, Noah's flood, confusion, Tower of Babel, so-called origin of people groups. But the very reason Christ came and died that horrible, cruel death on the cross was because of what happened back here. The Bible says there's going to be a consummation or a restoration. So just think, if you used millions of years of death and suffering, is he going to restore things back to millions of years of death and suffering? Of course not. The Bible tells me there's going to be no more death. Hermeneutically, start at the beginning, folks. Don't start at the end and work back. Start at the beginning. Understand Revelation. It says, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. In the midst of the New Jerusalem, look what's there again. There was the tree of life. and there shall be no more curse. Bible says, from the beginning, all your words are true, your righteous laws are eternal. The NJKV, the entirety of your word is truth. King James Version, thy word is true from the beginning. Now, I don't know if everyone's Christian. You've just been bombarded with a full-on interpretation from a born-again Christian. I hope you've heard that there's an alternative explanation, but you know, there is a way that you can actually be immune from these deceptive experiences. Because one of the reasons people interpret them differently is because they're wearing a different set of glasses. And Paul tells us the man without the Spirit, what is that? That's the Spirit of God. A promise from God that when you believe in the one whom he sent, that you will be reborn. God's Spirit will dwell in you, and you'll actually be able to understand this phenomena, the nature of it for what it is. But he says it's foolishness to them. They cannot understand them because this has to be spiritually discerned. You know what? Science shows us there is a spiritual dimension to our universe. Therefore, there is a spiritual dimension of our existence. And you've got to try to account for that. My good friend Joe Jordan, in their book, Premise of Spiritual Warfare, you know, Joe described himself as a crystal ball-gazing New Ager. He says they didn't start out as Bible pounders with a point, in fact, quite the opposite. They were looking for the truth, just like everyone else. It was the research and the data they found that made believers out of them. I often tell people about Joe and Wes at the time, and I say, well, you know what? They tried to get outside the squares. Is there any group not being abducted by aliens? Yeah, you heard Bill D and some of the explanations today. So they rang their colleagues around America. That's religious stuff. Don't want to deal with that. Deal with the science. We want them to be ETs. Ring colleagues around the world, same thing. Don't worry about it. So what? Aliens don't like Christians, big deal. Well, they took themselves off to study the Bible. And guess what? They found that the Bible was the truth, the way, the life, manifest in the form of Jesus Christ, and they can explain this phenomena. And as we know, Joe said, over 400 encounters now where this phenomena has been halted in the name of Jesus Christ. That tells you about the spiritual nature of it. ideas have consequences. See, remember I said worldview? Our worldview is made up by where we think we came from. See, if you like a non-Christian worldview, says the earth's been here 4.5 billion years, death, suffering, bloodshed, disease over millions of years, that's led to man's existence. You and I are the pinnacle of evolution, but we all just came from pond scum. Makes you feel kind of special, doesn't it? See, what are the implications? Well, if evolution is true, the materialistic worldview, because that's what it is, it's the driving mechanisms, the engine room behind humanism. Everything made itself. No creator, nobody owns me, therefore you can do what you want with your life. I want to sleep with another guy, who's to say that's wrong? It's my body after all. The Bible's morality gets rejected. Why? Because its foundational book gets rejected. The first book's not right. Where does the truth begin? Which bits are you going to pick out to suit yourself? You've got to take it all, I believe, or none. Okay, so you can make up your own rules about life if you're just an evolved ape. But you know what? If the Bible's history is true, we're all descended from Adam, God sets the rules. Sorry about that. It's his creation, his universe. But what do I mean when the Bible's history is true? Well, read it yourself. Go to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and you can actually trace Jesus' ancestry. One line through Mary, one line through Joseph. You'll go back to, who's there? Solomon, David, Abraham, all the way back to who? Adam. Real people in real time and space to show that the Bible is real history. And you know what? You can actually map out those chronologies. Remember, Usher dated the world around about 4004 BC. I actually think that's pretty old, believe it or not. The only reason we don't think it's old is because we're all indoctrinated in the idea of millions and billions of years. But, you know, it's interesting that if you looked at those chronologies, you can't get millions of years in there. Isn't that interesting? Even if there were gaps, which I don't think there are, you're not going to get millions of years in there. Have a look at this. Jeffrey Dahmer, sadly one of America's worst serial killers, when he was in prison on NBC, he said, if a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, he said, what's the point of trying to modify your behaviour to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believe the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. You know, when we died, that's it. There's nothing. Well, it's a pretty sad story, isn't it? Now, you might think that's an extreme example, but, you know, I've had conversations with dozens and dozens of teenagers who say, hey, you know what? There's no life after death. You just live, you die, they burn you up, they put you in the ground. Now, you know, have you ever been to Australia? Anybody here been to Australia? Land down under? Yeah. What do you think of it? Pretty nice? Yeah? You know why Australia's so nice? I often tell people it's full of Australians. That's why. But anyway, the reason I ask that is, do you know that we actually have the second highest youth suicide rate in the developed world in Australia? And yet most of us all live near the coast. We've got everything we want. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But the more you teach people they've come from nothing and they're going to nothing, teenagers actually have it hard these days. There's a lot of pressures. Hormones, relationships on top of studies, etc. So have a look at what our leading teachers and philosophers are telling us today. Bertrand Russell, he says, well, we're just a curious accident in a backwater. Peter Atkins from Oxford, he says, we're just a bit of slime on the planet. Here we have Stephen Jay Gould, remember him? Former professor of paleontology at Harvard. He's now dead, so I believe he's become a creationist. He says, we're a fortuitous cosmic afterthought, a tiny little twig on the enormously arborescent bush of life. That's pretty language, isn't it? And Richard Dawkins, you know this man? The world's most rabid anti-Christian. You know, what happens is we see silvery, shiny objects, metallic-looking craft fly into one another at incredible speeds, become one object, fly off in different directions, and they defy the very laws of physics. People that claim abductions, they say the aliens pass through the walls or the roof, and then when they get abducted, they claim they go through the walls or the roof. I said, what can be happening? Can that really be happening to real physical beings, real physical craft? And he said, man, I've never heard any of that stuff before. He said, how come you know so much? And I said, well, I just happened to have written a book on the subject. And then I sold him a copy. But the point is, there I am in the middle of a shopping centre having an opportunity to use this information to engage people about it, you see. See, what happens is, regardless of what the facts are, and I'll talk about what are facts, what is evidence, we all have a worldview, everybody. Once you reach an age of understanding, you develop a worldview. You're probably thinking, do I have a worldview? And no, I don't, but actually you do. Everybody, once you reach that age of understanding, you develop a worldview. And a worldview is like a set of glasses for which you view all of reality around you. That's how you interpret your world. It's like a set of glasses, a filter, a framework. And think about this. I believe that people's worldviews primarily are made up by where you think you came from. Think about that. If you think that you are just, the byproduct of chance random processes over millions of years, evolution, then you know what? There's ultimately no meaning and purpose to your life. What you believe about where you came from also affects your belief about what you think happens to you when you die. If you've come from nothing, guess what? You're going to nothing. But hey, if there's a creator, and if God's revealed himself to us, as the Bible says, that's how we can find out about him, well, he says there is meaning and purpose to your life. You're created with a purpose, and there's life after this one. So the decisions you make in this life are pretty important. Your worldview interprets how you behave. I'm a former evolutionist here today. He used to go around ridiculing Christians, so I've had a real conversion experience. Let me give you an example of that behaviour that you might play out according to your worldview. I remember watching those Ethiopian famines in Africa many years ago. Remember those? Seeing starving women and kids. Terrible situation. But consistent with my evolutionary worldview, I said, well, you know what? They're obviously just overpopulating, so what we need to do is allow them to die out, stop wasting money. It's just going to happen again next year, and allow nature to restore the balance. Now, I'm horrified that I used to think like that, but it was consistent with my evolutionary worldview. Now, as a Christian, what would be my motivation for going helping those people? Well, if the Bible's history is true, if we take it at face value, they are related to Adam and Eve. They are human beings. They're made in the image of God. And when Jesus walked this earth and he healed the sick and he fed the hungry and clothed the poor, he was reversing, if you like, the effects of the curse, wasn't he? That would be my motivation, following his example. See, folks, I'm a realist. Evolution is the most popular view, the most ruling paradigm of today, but does it mean that it's the truth? See, most people believe in evolution, you know why? Because that's all they've been taught. Anybody here heard information for creation in the classroom or on the media? Of course not. Like me, I was only ever exposed to one point of view, but I believe the evidence for creation and a young earth is not only scientifically defensible, but also logically and theologically defensible. See, there are consequences with our ideas. Have you heard this idea that today? His book, The God Delusion, an Amazon #1 bestseller. And lots of people like his stuff. He says we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, but nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And you wonder why young people are committing suicide. See, folks, when we talk about the past, evolution or creation, and you hear evolution as science, well, you need to understand it's a different type of science. And I've broken it down like this. You see, the type of science, when we hear that word, that we understand when we hear that word, is what we call operational or experimental science. Now, that deals with experiments that you can do in the present, you can repeat those experiments, and you can observe the results. So if I wanted to, test this theory of gravity, I could probably jump on the hotel roof and take a nice swan dive. I'd do it in the present. I couldn't repeat it, but you folks could observe the results. Oh, gravity really works. But what about evolution? Or what's known here as historical or forensic science? See, it deals with events that happened in the past. Those events supposedly happen only once only, or one-off. Do we see evolution happening today? Now, some of you might be thinking of natural selection. I'm going to talk about that. Do you know, I was in South Africa a few years ago, and this guy came up to challenge me, and he said, "You creationists, you bang on about operational science, and then you actually ignore it." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, fossils." He said, "Everybody knows that fossils take millions of years to form." He said, "Therefore, your idea of a young earth, young creation is just blown right out of the water." How would you answer that? See, questions are actually an opportunity. Because I was actually able to show this guy he was basing his whole eternal destiny on something he knew very little about. And that's what people understand about evolution. Most people believe it to be true. You actually ask them what they know about it. Very little. So I actually showed him a picture like this one. And I said, "Well, are you interested in fossils?" "I'm interested in fossils." I said, "Is there a particular fossil you've got a problem with?" Most people don't know the names of any fossils. And see what's special about this one? We believe it's extinct. It's a marine reptile called an ichthyosaur. 2 metres is just over 6 feet. But notice what's really neat about it? There's the baby coming out of the birth canal. Now, some of you mothers here may have had very difficult labours, right? But can you imagine giving birth slowly over millions of years while you're slowly being fossilised? Of course, doesn't make sense. So what had to happen to this great creature in the process of giving birth? Well, I'll show you from the books that I was taught at high school in Australia. And I know you have the same books here. I've seen them in England. And they're actually being taught at elementary level now. And this is how they explain how fossils are formed. Here's old Freddy Fish swimming along, and he dies and he sinks to the ocean floor. Now, while he's lying on the ocean floor, look at these high mountains. A little bit of mud and sediment over a long period of time, gradually washes out, buries the fish, and then the process starts again, and we get something like the geologic column from that. Well, let's have a think about this, because that's what I was taught to think, and much better you teach people how to think. Actually, what happens to fish when they die? Do they sink or do they float? You would think in the wild they float. Other fish come in, chew some lumps off. Maybe the carcass sinks to the bottom, and crabs, crustacean, bacteria. You're lucky if you've got a piece of backbone left after the couple of days, right? So how do you get a fossil, like this one, using that process? See, what you actually need, here's old Freddy Fish swimming along, you need a lot of mud and a lot of water in a little bit of time. You can bury the fish quickly in those layers, and before long you can get yourself a rapid fossil. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, well, yeah, that's a bit simplistic, because it's actually the
Gary Bates is the head of ministry for Creation Ministries International in Australia, and he's also the CEO of CMI-Worldwide. CMI now has 7 offices around the world. He's a regular contributor to the world-renowned Creation magazine, which now has subscribers in over 170 countries. But Gary is best known as the author of Alien Intrusion, UFOs, and the Evolution Connection, which is the only creation book on Amazon.com top 50 bestseller list. The book deals with the highly controversial UFO phenomena from a biblical perspective. Please welcome up Gary Bates from Australia.
Thank you. Well, good day. Okay, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. So the reality is, I read somewhere that, when pastors spend weeks preparing sermons, that the audience retention rate is about 10%. So I've got quite a long session here, and that doesn't encourage me very much that you're going to remember a lot, but I'll show you how you can remember most of it by telling you some of the resources, etc., that we have at the end. First part of my talk, I'm going to lay a framework, because a lot of people in the church today, they say, well, creation, evolution, it's just one of those side issues that the church is dealing with. We can deal with issues like stem cells and therapeutic cloning and abortion and homosexuality and all of these issues. But actually, I believe that this is the issue of all issues for the church today, because it's a foundational issue. And you'll see that this UFO phenomenon, if you like, is also a subset of this issue that we have to deal with. But unless the church, if you like, reclaims its origins, we're really not going to understand how people think. We're not going to continue to be relevant to the culture out there with the questions that they have. Now, I should imagine for the Christians here today, if you've been out sharing your faith with people, have you had questions like, well, if the Bible's true, tell me how you fit dinosaurs in there. If the Bible's true, tell me where the races came from. What about distant starlight, billions of light years away? How do you fit that into a normal plain reading of Genesis that, and if we looked at the chronologies in the Bible, really only gives us a date in the thousands of years if we take it at face value? Or what about this question, probably the number one question I believe that we would get as Christians today? If there's a God of love, why does he allow all the death and suffering in the world? Would that be probably the number one question you receive today? Well, see, my experience is most Christians sort of say, well, don't worry about that. One day when we'll get to heaven, we'll find out all the answers. But in fact, there are actually very simple, straightforward answers to those questions. And what people are doing when they ask you those questions, they're actually saying to you, tell me why I should believe what you believe. They are stumbling blocks to their faith. And the reason is because our culture has changed in the last 30 to 40 years or so. And I believe it's linked to this teaching of evolution in school as fact. Now, I just want to do a couple of things at the moment. As I said, we're going to be pushed for time. I'm going to race through this. But we have a website called creation.com where you can get most of the answers to the most asked questions in over 32 years that our ministry has been around. There's nearly 7,000 fully searchable articles on that website. So questions on creation, evolution, you'll find most of them there. We have a free email news called InfoBytes. And we send it out to supporters when there's some claims in the news or something like that we think that people should know about. There was one that Jesus really didn't walk on water, he just walked on ice. So there's a naturalistic explanation. This one here, you remember Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter? He's actually more famous in this country than my own, funny enough. But, you know, his zoo is just a couple of hours north of where I live in Brisbane. And when he died, do you know, lots of people, Christians and non-believers, actually contacted us and saying, well, if God's a God of love and he's the creator, did he design stingrays to kill people? How would you answer that question? It's a valid question, by the way. Well, Dr. David Catchpole, one of our research scientists, he wrote an article called The Stingray of Death on our website. We put it into our free email news, send it out to our supporters, just a paragraph with a link to the article. Do you know that within 10 days that became the most visited article ever on our website? And that told me that in this electronic age, people were just clicking forward to their friends and their family, and people were getting good biblical answers as to why there is death and suffering, why we see it, apparent design in creatures to see death and suffering. You know, one of the reasons I got involved in this is actually I saw the link in sci-fi and extraterrestrial beliefs linked to what is the core focus of our ministry, which is the creation-evolution debate. But I was really confronted when I started to research this subject. I'll be quite frank with you, I thought that maybe people who had abduction experiences, well, they were just UFO wannabes and it was in the realm of psychological delusions. But after meeting dozens and dozens of people who've had experiences, I came to realise that they can't all be watching the same science fiction movies. But, you know, I wrote this book really as a layperson's book. It's a creation book, but it's in disguise. You won't see Jesus, God, or the Bible mentioned on the cover anywhere. And as Guy mentioned, it's been an Amazon top 50 bestseller. And we mentioned that, but it's not to boast, because in fact more non-Christians have read this book than Christians. Because presumably that's the majority of people who buy the book on Amazon, right? And, you know, we've seen conversion testimonies come through, and it's a great conversation starter. Now, Joe mentioned these guys this morning, Spread the Word Ministry. They wrote to me when my book was published. I'm sitting there in Australia, and I find out a major Christian ministry in the United States took an advertisement in World Magazine, and they listed it as one of the top 10 books every Christian should read. And I thought, wow, I'm glad. Some people in the church are starting to see this as an issue that needs to be addressed, right? So anyway, I wrote to these guys and I said, hey, could you let me use that sticker for my own website? You can see it on the back of my laptop there, how I've incorporated it. And they were generous enough to allow me to do that. And I was at my local shopping mall, you know, and I was in the shopping centre, and it was one of these undercover car parks. And I parked the car and I walked to the entrance, and this man was shouting as I got to the entrance, "Oi, mate, you!" And I looked around with about a dozen other startled people, and he's pointing his finger at me, and he said, "Oi, you, stop, you, stay!" And he started running at me. And I thought, hello, it's going to be on, you know. What did I do? And he runs up to me breathlessly and he said, "Mate, I saw that sticker on your car. Where do you think aliens come from?" In the middle of a shopping centre. Now, that's happened numerous times since. But I hit him with 5 fast facts, and that's all you need to know. And I said, well, do you know what? I said, no 2 UFO sightings have ever appeared alike, exactly alike. We never see them enter our atmosphere from outside. When they appear, they're already here.